La Verdadera Historia de los Asesinos, Sombras en las Montañas. Sierra los ojos y imagina, si quieres, una noche de luna, en el año 1092 en las escarpadas montañas del norte de Persia. Muy por encima de las llanuras desérticas, encaramada en un afloramiento rocoso que parece tocar las nubes, se alza una fortaleza inexpugnable llamada Alamut. Su nombre significa nido de Águila. Y como el hogar de Águila, domina las vistas de todo lo que hay debajo, aunque es casi imposible de alcanzar desde el suelo. Dentro de los muros de la fortaleza, en cámaras iluminadas por lámparas de aceite, y líneas del aroma del incienso, un hombre lee textos antiguos. Su nombre es Hassan-i Sabbah, y está a punto de crear algo que el mundo nunca ha visto antes. Una organización tan misteriosa, tan efectiva, tan aterradora que su mismo nombre resonará durante 9 siglos para convertirse en sinónimo de asesinato político. Está a punto de fundar la Orden de Asesinos. Pero la historia que crees conocer, la de asesinos drogadictos y jardines paradisíacos, de hombres que así lanzan a la muerte a la orden de su amo, y es en gran parte un mito. La verdadera historia de los asesinos y es mucho más compleja, fascinante y humana de lo que sugiere la leyenda. Esta noche, separemos los hechos de la ficción, siguiendo la amenaza de la verdad a través de siglos de exageración y propaganda. Viajaremos desde las polvorientas bibliotecas de la Persia del siglo XI hasta los reinos cruzados, desde las fortalezas de las montañas hasta las cortes de los sultanes, desde las disputas teológicas hasta los asesinatos políticos que cambiaron el curso de la historia. Conoceremos a filósofos y guerreros, visionarios y fanáticos, víctimas y sobrevivientes. Entenderemos como una pequeña minoría religiosa, armada con poco más que coraje y puñals, mantuvo a los poderosos de su época en constante temor. Así que accommodate, ponte cómodo, y deja que tu mente viaje a través de los siglos. Nuestra historia no comienza con un asesinato, sino con la fe, con una disputa teológica que dividiría al Islam y daría origen a una de las organizaciones más legendarias de la historia. El camino para comprender a los asesinos pasa por una compleja historia religiosa, pero quédense conmigo. El viaje merece la pena. Capítulo 1. La División, Sunnis, Chiitas y las Semillas del Conflicto. Para comprender a los asesinos, primero debemos comprender una división que ocurrió en la primera generación tras la muerte del profeta Mahoma, en el año 632 DC. No se trató de un desacuerdo teológico menor. Fue una división fundamental que marcaría la historia islámica durante 14 siglos, y on sigu. La historia comienza con una pregunta sencilla. ¿Quién debería liderar la comunidad musulmana tras la muerte del profeta? Mahoma no tuvo hijos supervivientes. No dio instrucciones claras sobre la sucesión. Diferentes grupos dentro de la comunidad musulmana primitiva tenían ideas diferentes sobre quién debía liderar. Un grupo creía que el liderazgo debía recaer en la persona más cualificada entre los compañeros de Mahoma, algo elegido por consenso de los ancianos de la comunidad. Eligieron a Abu Bakr, uno de los amigos más cercanos de Mahoma, y uno de los primeros conversos, como el primer califa, y es Decker su ser. Pero otro grupo creía que el liderazgo debía permanecer en la familia del profeta. Apoyaron a Ali Abi Talib, primo y yerno de Mahoma, casado con Fátima, la hija de Mahoma. Este grupo argumentaba que el profeta había designado Ali como su sucesor, aunque esta designación era sutil y podía interpretarse de diferentes maneras. Consideraban que Ali había sido ignorado injustamente. Ali eventualmente se convertiría en el cuarto califa, pero su reinado estuvo marcado por la guerra civil. Fue asesinado en el año 661 DC. Muerto por una espada envenenada mientras rezaba en una mezquita. Sus partidarios, que se autodenominaban Chiitas, y es Decker, partidarios o seguidores de Ali. Creen que el liderazgo de la comunidad musulmana debía pasar a los descendientes de Ali a través de sus hijos Hassan y Hussein. El grupo meritario que ligaría a la mar sunita aceptó la dinastía gobernante. Primero los Omayas y luego los Abbasids. Pero los Chiitas nunca aceptaron del todo la legitimidad de estos gobernantes. Sostenían que solo los descendientes de Ali y Fatima tenían derecho a dirigir la comunidad musulmana. Creen que estos líderes legítimos eran imams, individuos guiados por la divinidad que poseían una autoridad espiritual especial. En el año 680 DC, el hijo menor de Ali, Hussein, murió en la batalla de Karbala, en lo que hoy es Irak. Él y su pequeño grupo de seguidores, que incluía mujeres y niños, fueron masacrados por las fuerzas del califa Umayyad Yazid. Esta tragedia se convirtió en un elemento central de la identidad chiita, conmemorada anualmente en ceremonias de duelo. La muerte de Hussein dejó claro que los chiitas no eran simplemente una facción política, sino una minoría perseguida, que mantenía vivas sus creencias a pesar de la oposición de los poderosos. Durante los siglos siguientes, los chiitas se dividieron en múltiples ramas, según aquellos de los descendientes de Ali reconocen como imams legítimos. El grupo más numeroso, los Tácticas, reconocieron una línea de 12 imams. El último, de los cuales desapareció en el año 874 DC. Creen que este duodécimo imán está oculto, esperando regresar al fin de los tiempos para establecer la justicia en la tierra. Pero otro grupo siguió una línea diferente. Reconocieron solo 7 imams, dividiéndose de los 12 ver sobre quien debería suceder al sexto imán. Jafar al-Sadi cuando murió en el año 765 D.C. Los 12 ver reconocieron a Musa, hijo de Jafar, como el séptimo imán. Este otro grupo, llamado Ismael, reconoció a Ismael, otro hijo de Jafar, como el legítimo séptimo imán. Aunque Ismael había muerto antes que su padre, los Ismaels desarrollaron enseñanzas teológicas y filosóficas distintivas. Creen en la interpretación esotérica de las escrituras islámicas, sosteniendo que los textos sagrados tenían significados externos obvios y significados internos ocultos accesibles solo para los iniciados. Se organizaron en niveles de iniciación, y el conocimiento se revelaba gradualmente a los miembros a medida que demostraban su valía. Para el siglo X, los Ismaels se habían convertido en una fuerza significativa en el mundo islámico. Una dinastía ismaelí, los Fatimis, gobernaron Egipto y gran parte del norte de África, y el Levante desde su capital en el Cairo. Los Fatimis eran chiíes ismaelí y desafiaban directamente al califato Abbasi sunita en Bagdad. Durante un tiempo, pareció que el caísmo ismaelita podría convertirse en una fuerza dominante en el mundo islámico. Pero a finales del siglo XI, la propia comunidad ismaelita experimentó una crisis y se dividió. El Kif Fatima al-Mustali murió en 1094. La sucesión fue disputada. El heredero designado Nisar fue ignorado en favor de su hermano menor, al-Mustali, en un golpe de estado palaciego orquestado por poderosos funcionarios de la corte. Nisar se rebeló, pero fue capturado y encarcelado, muriendo en circunstancias misteriosas. Algunos ismaelitas aceptaron a al-Mustali como nuevo jefe imán, pero otros, especialmente en Persia y Siria, se negaron a reconocerlo. Insisten en que Nizar había sido el imán legítimo y creen que la línea de Nizar continuaba a pesar de su muerte. Estos ismaelitas nazaríes se encontraron como una minoría dentro de una minoría dentro de una minoría, una pequeña secta del caísmo, separada tanto de la mayoría sunita como de la comunidad ismaelita principal. Fue en este contexto, en esta posición marginal múltiple, que surgieron los asesinos. Eran disidentes religiosos, rebeldes teológicos, una minoría perseguida con poderosos enemigos por todas partes. La Dinastia Turca Seleucidas Sunita que Goberno Persia a finales del siglo XI los consideraba regios, y amenazas al orden social. Los gobernantes fatimis de Egipto los veían como traidores a la causa ismaili. Carecían de ejército, territorio y protectores poderosos. Lo que se conoban era un líder de extraordinaria inteligencia y determinación. Un hombre que tomaría esta posición desesperada y la transformaría en uno de los movimientos políticos más efectivos de la época medieval. Su nombre era Hassan-i. Sabbah estaba a punto de demostrar al mundo que el poder no siempre proviene de ejércitos y territorio. A veces proviene de un compromiso absoluto, una organización perfecta, y la voluntad de atacar a los enemigos donde se sienten más seguros, en el corazón de sus propios palacios y cortes. Este fue el mundo que vio nacer a los asesinos. Un mundo de división sectaria, intriga política, complejidad teológica y conflicto violento. Para comprender en qué se convirtieron los asesinos, debemos comprender de qué huían y por qué creen luchar. No eran asesinos sin mente ni fanáticos drogadictos. Eran creyentes convencidos de defender la verdadera fe contra la corrupción y la herejía, dispuestos a sacrificarlo todo, incluso sus vidas, por lo que consideraban la verdad divinamente ordenada. Capítulo 2. Hassan-i Sabbah, el anciano de la montaña. Hassan-i Sabbah nació alrededor del año 1050 DC, en la ciudad de K, en Persia, en lo que hoy es Irán. Provenía de una familia de 12 musulmanes chiitas, la rama meritaria del caísmo. Pero de joven, se convirtió al islamismo. No fue una decisión casual. La conversión al islamismo en la Persia del siglo XI podía ser peligrosa, lo que lo convertía en sospechoso ante las autoridades sunnis gobernantes. Hassan era, según todos los indicios, brillante. Estudió matemáticas, astronomía, filosofía y teología. Las fuentes antiguas lo describen como austero, disciplinado, completamente dedicado a su fe y a su misión. No bebía vino, no se entregaba a los placeres, y vivía con sencillez, a pesar de que posteriormente disponía de importantes recursos. Su personalidad combinaba sofisticación intelectual con una absoluta certeza en sus creencias. Una combinación peligrosa y poderosa. A finales de sus 20 años, Hassan viajó a Egipto para estudiar con eruditos ismaelios en la corte fatimí de El Cairo. Pasó varios años profundizando su conocimiento de la doctrina ismaelí y estableciendo conexiones con los líderes del movimiento. Pero también se forjó una reputación de difícil, inflexible y políticamente problemático. Finalmente, abandonó Egipto o fue animado a hacerlo, y regresó a Persia. De regreso en Persia, Hassan viajó extensamente, enseñando la doctrina ismaelí en secreto, reclutando seguidores y construyendo una red de creyentes. Esta era una tarea peligrosa. Los turcos seleucidas que gobernaban Persia eran sunitas ortodoxos apoyados por clérigos poderosos que consideraban a los herejes de ismaelí merecedores de la muerte. Hassan operaba en la sombra, moviéndose de ciudad en ciudad, siempre un paso por delante de las autoridades, construyendo lentamente una organización. A principios de la década de 1090, Hassan decidió que su movimiento necesitaba una base segura, un lugar fuera del alcance de autoridades hostiles donde sus seguidores pudieran practicar su fe abiertamente y entrenarse para la misión que él imaginaba. Identificó el lugar perfecto, la fortaleza de Alamut, en lo alto de las montañas de Elers, al norte de la ciudad de Kazvin. Alamut era antiguo y estratégicamente valioso. Dominaba el valle y controlaba el acceso a importantes rutas comerciales. Era naturalmente defendable, ya que se alzaba sobre un escarpado afloramiento rocoso, con una única vía de acceso práctica. Pero estaba en manos de un gobernante local leal a los Seljuks. Hassan no podía atacar sin más. Carecía de ejército. En cambio, utilizo la sudaliza. Envio seguidores a la region. Quienes gradualmente convertirían a parte de la población local al islamismo. Se ganaron la confianza de la gente dentro de la propia fortaleza. Según la leyenda, el propio Hassan entró en la fortaleza disfrazado de maestro o santo, aunque este de tal podría ser un adorno. Lo cierto es que en 1090, los seguidores de Hassan dentro de Alamut dieron un golpe de estado incruento, tomando el control de la fortaleza y presentando al interior propietario una letra de cambio a un comerciante por el valor de la fortaleza como pago. El interior propietario, desconcertado, no tuvo más remedio que aceptar. Hassan-i Sabbah nunca abandonaría Alamut por el resto de su vida. Durante los siguientes 35 años, hasta su muerte en 1124, permaneció dentro de los muros de la fortaleza, dirigiendo su organización, escribiendo tratados teológicos, y enviando a sus seguidores en misiones por Persia y Siria. Fuentes antiguas afirman que solo salió de su casa 2 veces durante esas décadas, dedicando sus días al estudio, la oración y la planificación. Desde Alamut, Hassan construyó una organización sin igual en el mundo medieval. Estableció una red de fortalezas por todo el norte de Persia y posteriormente en Siria. Cada una era un centro de conocimiento y poder nazarí ismaili. Creó un sofisticado sistema de comunicación mediante mensajeros y señales. Organizó a sus seguidores en una jerarquía baida en el conocimiento y el compromiso. Hassan comprendió algo profundo. Su comunidad era demasiado pequeña y débil para librar guerras convencionales contra el poderoso Estado selyúcida. No tenía ninguna posibilidad en una batalla abierta. Pero no necesitaban ganar batallas. Necesitaban atemorizar a sus enemigos para demostrar que el poder y los guardias del palacio no podían garantizar la seguridad. Que apoyar a los selyúcidas significaba arriesgar la vida. El arma que Hassan eligió fue el asesinato selectivo, no de personas al azar, sino de líderes políticos y religiosos específicos que se oponían al nazario. Sus seguidores, llamados fidei, significaban que aquellos que se sacrificaban eran cuidadosamente seleccionados, ampliamente entrenados y absolutamente devotos. Viajaban al lugar del objetivo, a veces pasando meses integrandos en la comunidad, aprendiendo las rutinas y medidas de seguridad del objetivo. Luego, en un momento cuidadosamente elegido, a menudo en un lugar público como una mezquita o un mercado, el fidei atacaba. El arma era casi siempre una daga. Las espadas podían ser detenidas por armaduras o guardias. Las dagas podían ocultarse y usarse a corta distancia. El fidei no intentaba escapar. Tras matar al objetivo, solía esperar con calma a ser capturado y ejecutado, aceptando el martirio como el precio del éxito de su misión. El efecto psicológico era profundo. Si un visor, un general o un líder religioso podía ser asesinado en su propia mezquita rodeado de guardias, nadie estaba realmente salvo. El mensaje era claro. Openganza los amaticans del nazario y pagaran el precio personalmente, independientemente de su poder o protección. El primer gran asesinato ordenado por Hassan ocurrió en 1092, tan solo 2 años después de tomar Alamut. El objetivo era Nidim al-Mulk, el poderoso visir que había servido como primer ministro del sultán selyúcida durante casi 30 años. Nidim al-Mulk fue el artífice de la política antisemítica, responsable de la persecución y ejecución de creyentes islámicos. También fue uno de los administradores más capaces que el mundo islámico haya visto jamás. Un fedari disfrazado de místico sufí se acercó a Nidim al-Mulk mientras el visir era lavado en su litera. El asesino lo apuñaló y no intentó escapar. Nidim al-Mulk murió poco después a causa de sus heridas. El asesinato sumió en el caos a la administración selyúcida y demostró que la organización de Hassan podía llegar incluso a las figuras más poderosas del imperio. Esto inició un patrón que se prolongaría durante casi 2 siglos. Las figuras políticas que se oponían a los nazares serían condenados a muerte. Los asesinatos eran públicos, dramáticos y enviaban mensajes claros. Podemos llegar usted en cualquier lugar. Tus guardias no pueden proteger. Has un acuerdo con nosotros o muir. Pero el legado de Hassan fue más que un simple asesinato político. Transformó el nazarismo de una minoría dispersa y perseguida en una comunidad organizada y coherente con una identidad y un propósito claros. Fundó bibliotecas en Alamut, donde se conservaban y escriben textos de filosofía, ciencia y teología. Creó sistemas administrativos que permitirían al Estado nazari sobrevivir durante generaciones después de su muerte. Hassan también estableció el principio que definiría a los asesinos a lo largo de su existencia. La obediencia absoluta al idol llamado Gran Maestro o Señor de Alamut. La comunidad nazarí era jerárquica, pero no se basaba en la familia ni en la riqueza. Se basaba en el conocimiento espiritual y el compromiso. Los miembros podían ascender en la jerarquía demostrando su comprensión y devoción. Esto creó una notable coherencia y disciplina organizativa. Las fuentes antiguas, en particular las hostiles a los asesinos, describían a Hassan como un mago oscuro, un manipulador que usaba engaños y drogas para controlar a sus seguidores. Afirmaban que había creado un paraíso falso en Alamut, drogando a jóvenes y dejándolos déspota en un hermoso jardín lleno de hermosas mujeres, diciéndoles que ese era el paraíso, y que podrían regresar para siempre si morían cumpliendo sus órdenes. Esta historia, popularizada por Marco Polo siglos después, y es casi con toda seguridad falsa. No existe evidencia arqueológica de tal jardín. Más importante aún, el perfil psicológico carece de sentido. Los federados demostraron demasiada sofisticación, demasiada planificación a largo plazo, y adaptabilidad como para ser fanáticos drogadictos. Eran creyentes, sí, absolutamente comprometidos, pero comprometidos por la fe y la ideología, no por una burda manipulación. Hassan-i Sabbah murió en 1124 tras 35 años dirigiendo la comunidad nazarí de Alamut. Había ejecutado a sus propios hijos por supuestamente conspirar contra él y por beber vino, lo que demuestra que su disciplina se aplicaba a su propia familia. Dejó atrás una organización que controlaba docenas de fortalezas, tenía miles de seguidores, y había cambiado fundamentalmente el cálculo político de toda la región. Se lo conoce como el anciano de la montaña, un título que se aplicaría a sus sucesores, y que resonaría a lo largo de la historia. Pero Hassan era más que un simple anciano en una fortaleza. Fue un visionario que comprendió la guerra asimétrica siglos antes de que existiera el término, que comprendió que la debilidad podía transformarse en fuerza mediante la inteligencia, la planificación y un compromiso absoluto. Su legado moldearía Oriente Medio durante 2 siglos más, hasta que los mongols finalmente destruyeron lo que él había construido. Capítulo 3. La red de fortalezas. Alamut y los Nidos de Águila. Ascendemos ahora en nuestra imaginación. El sendero rocoso que conduce a Alamut. El acceso es traicionero. Senderos estrechos se penean por las empinadas laderas de la montaña. En algunos tramos, el camino atraviesa corredores de piedra natural, apenas lo suficientemente anchos como para que un hombre pueda pasar. Los defensores en la cima podían lanzar flechas, rocas y así hirviendo sobre cualquiera que intentara escalar. Para un ejército hostil, tomar Alamut requeriría un asedio que duraría meses o años, suponiendo que pudieran establecer una posición segura en la montaña. En la cima, la fortaleza se alzaba sobre roca viva. Partes de la estructura fueron excavadas directamente en la montaña, camaras de piedra excavadas en la pared del acantilado. Otras partes se construyen con piedras cuidadosamente encajadas, torres de 9 o 12 metros de altura, con muros lo suficientemente gruesos como para resistir cualquier máquina de asedio de la época. La fortaleza podía albergar a cientos de personas, con almacenes capaces de almacenar provisiones durante años si fuera necesario. Dentro de estos muros, los necesarios miles crearon una comunidad autosuficiente. Había taleras donde los artesanos fabricaban armas, ropa y herramientas. Había establos para caballos y mulas, aunque los animales debían ser conducidos con sumo cuidado por los senderos de la montaña. Había cocinas, salas de reuniones y residencias. Y lo más importante, había una biblioteca, una de las mejores del mundo persa, que contenía miles de manuscritos sobre temas que abarcaban desde teología hasta astronomía y medicina. Los nazis valoraban profundamente el conocimiento. Recopilaron libros de todo el mundo islámico, copiando y preservando textos que de otro modo se habrían perdido. Estudiaban no solo temas religiosos, sino también filosofía, ciencia, matemáticas y historia. La comunidad de Alamut incluía eruditos, científicos y filósofos, además de guerreros y administradores. El agua provenía de manantiales de montaña, y se gestionaba cuidadosamente mediante un sistema de aljibes y canales. Los alimentos provenían en parte de suministros traídos de los valles, y en parte de huertos, y pequeños campos donde quiera, que se encontrara terreno llano en la montaña. Los nazaríes cultivaban relaciones con las poblaciones locales de los valles, comerciando con ellas, a veces reclutándolas, y mantenían una red de apoyo que les proporcionaba suministros y información. Pero Alamut era solo la joya de la corona en una red de fortalezas. A pocas décadas de la captura de Alamut por Hassan, los nazaríes controlaban docenas de fortalezas por todo el norte de Persia, concentradas en las regiones de Rudbar y Kahistan. Cada fortaleza estaba estratégicamente ubicada, dominando importantes pasos o rutas comerciales, posicionadas para apoyar a las demás, y a la vez ser defendibles de forma independiente. Estas fortalezas variaban en tamaño y carácter. Algunas eran más pequeñas que Alamut, quizás albergando solo unas pocas docenas de residentes permanentes. Otras eran importantes bastiones, con cientos de habitantes. Juntas, creían un estado discontinuo. Focos de control nazarí dispersos por territorio por lo demás hostil, conectados por senderos de montaña y comunicaciones secretas. Las fortalezas cumplían múltiples funciones. Eran bases militares, obviamente, lugares donde los fidei se entrenaban y desde donde partían en sus misiones. Pero también eran centros administrativos, escuelas religiosas, bibliotecas y santuarios. Los necesarios perseguidos de los valles y ciudades podían huir a las fortalezas, encontrando seguridad y comunidad entre sus correligionarios. La rama siria de la organización desarrolló su propia red de fortalezas centrada en Masaf, en las montañas de Jabal Ansariya. Los necesarios sirios operaban de forma semi-independiente de sus primos persas, lidiando con circunstancias políticas diferentes. Siria era un mosaico de pequeños estados, reinos cruzados a lo largo de la costa, principados musulmanes en el interior, y las poderosas dinastías en Jadwai. Posteriormente, Abid, que intentaban unificar la resistencia musulmana contra los cruzados. Masaf, al igual que Alamut, era prácticamente inexpugnable, encaramada en una colina rocosa con imponentes vistas del paisaje circundante. Los necesarios iranos llegaron a controlar una red de fortalezas, que incluía Kaf, Cadmus, Kawabi y otras. Desde estas bases, desarrollaban un complejo juego político, a veces aliándose con los cruzados contra rivals musulmanes, a veces oponiéndose a ellos, siempre trabajando para proteger a su comunidad y expandir su influencia. La vida dentro de las fortalezas seguía una rutina estricta. Los miembros de la comunidad observaban las oraciones islámicas 5 veces al día, pero con modificaciones ismails a la práctica suní estándar. Estudiaban textos religiosos, memorizaban escrituras, y aprendían interpretaciones esotéricas. El entrenamiento físico era constante para los seleccionados como fidei. Práctica de armas, equitación, escalada, y entrenamiento de resistencia. Pero los fidei no eran solo guerreros. Se les entrenaba en muchas habilidades útiles para la infiltración, y la recopilación de información. Aprendieron idiomas, estudiaron las costumbres, y creencias de diferentes comunidades religiosas para hacerse pasar por cristianos, sunitas, sufis o cualquier identidad que su misión requiriera. Aprendieron oficios que les darían motivos para viajar, y acceso a diferentes círculos sociales. Comerciante, artesano, peregrino, erudito. El entrenamiento enfatizaba la paciencia, y la disciplina. Un fighter podía pasar meses o incluso años estableciendo una identidad falsa antes de atacar. Debía mantener su disfraz a la perfección, practicando las oraciones y costumbres del grupo al que fingiera pertenecer, sin despertar nunca sospechas. Esto requería inteligencia, adaptabilidad y un autocontrol absoluto. Las fortalezas mantenían un sistema de seguridad riguroso. Los desconocidos eran desafiados. Sus identidades se verificaban mediante contraseñas o reconocimiento por parte de miembros establecidos. Las conversaciones importantes se llevaban a cabo en lugares seguros donde era imposible escuchar escondidas. Los mensajes entre fortalezas a menudo se cifraban, con remitentes y destinatarios utilizando códigos que solo entendían los miembros iniciados. Las excavaciones arqueológicas en Alamut y otras fortalezas han revelado la sofisticación de estas comunidades. Restos de sofisticados sistemas de gestión del agua, estructuras defensivas cuidadosamente diseñadas, y los cimientos de grandes edificios dan testimonio de una planificación organizada a largo plazo. Fragmentos de cerámica muestran conexiones comerciales que se extendían desde China hasta el Mediterráneo. Monedas de varios reinos sugieren extensas redes comerciales. Las fortalezas no estaban aisladas del mundo. Estaban conectadas a él a través de complejas redes de comercio, espionage y diplomacia. Los comerciantes simpatizantes de la causa nazarí transportaban mensajes y mercancías entre fortalezas y ciudades. Los espías en tribunales y mercados informaban sobre los acontecimientos políticos. Los diplomáticos negociaban con gobernantes que consideraban ventajoso la paz con los asesinos en lugar de la guerra. La seguridad física de las fortalezas otorgaba a la comunidad nazarí algo valioso. Seguridad para practicar su fe abiertamente. Criar hijos en sus creencias y vivir sin temor constante a la persecución. En las fortalezas, un adolescente podía estudiar teología Ismailí sin riesgo de arresto. Una familia podía observar las prácticas Ismailí sin esconderse de vecinos hostiles. Los eruditos podían debatir interpretaciones de textos sagrados sin temor a que la discusión fuera reportada a las autoridades sunitas. Este aspecto de las fortalezas a menudo se pasa por alto en los relatos centrados en asesinatos y intrigas. Las fortalezas eran hogares, comunidades donde la gente vivía plenamente, celebrando matrimonios, logrando muertes, criando hijos y envejeciendo. Eran lugares de culto, aprendizaje y vida humana normal, no solo plataformas para asesinatos. Sin embargo, la función militar seguía siendo central. Las fortalezas posibilitaban la estrategia del asesino. Sin importar cuántos fidei fueron capturados y ejecutados, sin importar cuántas comunidades nazaríes locales fueron perseguidas en los territorios controlados por los sunitas, las fortalezas perduraban, proporcionaban continuidad, memoria institucional, y la capacidad de entrenar a nuevas generaciones de creyentes y guerreros. Durante casi 2 siglos, desde 1090 hasta las invasiones mongolas de mediados del siglo XIII, estas fortalezas se alzaron como monumentos a la determinación de los nazarí Ismail de sobrevivir y preservar su fe. eran, en efecto, nidos de águila, encaramados a una altura imposible, que parecían tocar el cielo. Hogar de una comunidad que se negaba a ser destruida a pesar de la hostilidad del poderoso mundo inferior. Capítulo 4. La filosofía del asesinato, teología y tácticas. ¿Por qué matar? Esta pregunta parece simple, pero para los necesariamente requiere una sofisticada justificación teológica. Eran musulmanes, personas de fe que creen en el juicio divino, y la responsabilidad moral. El Corán es claro sobre la santidad de la vida, afirmando que matar a una persona inocente es como matar a toda la humanidad. ¿Cómo podían entonces los musulmanes fieles aceptar el asesinato como un deber religioso? La respuesta residía en la comprensión nazi de la justicia, la autoridad espiritual, y el conflicto entre la verdad exotérica y la esotérica. Creen que el mundo estaba sumido en una lucha cósmica entre la verdad y la falsedad, entre la guía legítima del imán y el gobierno corrupto de usurpadores y tiranos. En este contexto, la violencia contra quien suprimían la verdad no era asesinato, era justicia divina, ejecución de la voluntad de Dios. La concepción nazaria de la autoridad religiosa se centraba en el imán, el líder divino guiado, descendiente directo del profeta Mahoma a través de Ali y Fátima. El imán poseía un conocimiento especial, acceso a los significados profundos de las escrituras, que los creyentes comunes no podían comprender. La obediencia al imán era obediencia a la voluntad de Dios manifestada en el mundo. Cuando el imán, hablando a través de su representante en Alamut, identificaba a alguien como enemigo de la verdadera fe, alguien cuya existencia causaba daño a la comunidad nazarí, y obstruía el camino hacia la verdad, y esa persona así convertía en un objetivo legítimo. La orden de eliminar a dicha persona venía con autoridad divina. Negar sería desobedecer a Dios. Este marco teológico transformó el asesinato de crimen a sacramento. El fedari que abaixó a un visor o general no era un asesino. Era un guerrero santo que cumplía un deber sagrado al servicio de la verdad suprema. Su disposición a sacrificar su propia vida en el acto lo convertía en una forma de martirio que merecía una recompensa divina. Pero los nazaríes no eran asesinos al azar. Operaban según principios claros, una especie de ética del asesinato. Los objetivos se eligen cuidadosamente por razones políticas o religiosas específicas. Se evitaban las bajas civiles. Los nazaríes atacaban a individuos, no a poblaciones. La violencia era instrumental, calculada para lograr objetivos políticos, no sádica ni gratuita. Comparemos esto con muchos conflictos medievales donde los ejércitos quemaban aldeas, masacraban civiles, y se dedicaban a la destrucción generalizada. Los cruzados masacraban poblaciones enteras de las ciudades que capturaban. Los ejércitos mongols destruían todo ser vivo en las regiones que se resistían. En este contexto, el asesinato selectivo de los nazaríes, por impactante que fuera, era en realidad relativamente selectivo. La táctica del asesinato público tenía múltiples propósitos. En primer lugar, demostraba el alcance y la capacidad de la organización, mostrando a los enemigos potenciales que ningún lugar era realmente seguro. En segundo lugar, envió un mensaje a otros posibles oponentes. Opónganse a nosotros y este será su destino. En tercer lugar, convirtió a los fidei en mártires, inspirando a otros miembros de la comunidad y reforzando la narrativa teológica del sacrificio por la verdad. El requisito de que los fidei no intentaran escapar fue crucial. Si hubieran intentado matar y huir, habrían parecido delincuentes comunes, temerosos de la justicia. Al aceptar la captura y la ejecución con calma, demostraron que no los motivaba el interés propio, sino la fe. Transformaron sus muertes en testimonio, dando literalmente fe de sus creencias. Los relatos contemporáneos describen a los fidei enfrentándose a la ejecución con una serenidad notable. Recitaban orations, Haitian declarations de fe, y no mostraban miedo a la muerte. Este comportamiento impresionó incluso a sus enemigos, quienes admiraban a regañadientes la valencia del asesino, aunque detestaban sus métodos y creencias. El impacto psicológico en los objetivos, y en los objetivos potenciales fue inmenso. Imaginen ser un funcionario seleucida que ha ordenado la persecución de los nazares. Sabes que en algún lugar, quizás en tu ciudad, un fidei podría estar estableciendo una identidad encubierta, aprendiendo tus rutinas, esperando el momento perfecto para atacar. Tus guardias no pueden proteger en tu momento. No puedes vivir en una fortaleza para siempre. El miedo se vuelve corrosivo, constante, y debilita tu voluntad. Algunos objetivos buscaron la paz con los nazares, decidiendo que la conciliación era preferable al miedo constante ser asesinados. Este fue exactamente el resultado. Hassan-i se buscó hacer que oponerse a los nazares fuera más peligroso que tolerarlos. Crear una situación en la que los poderosos calcularan que perseguir a los nazares no valía la pena el riesgo personal. Las tácticas de los nazares evolucionaron con el tiempo. Inicialmente, sus objetivos eran casi exclusivamente líderes musulmanes, funcionarios seleucidas, representantes abasis y clérigos suníes que predicaban contra el islamismo. Los asesinatos fueron actos de autodefensa y venganza contra los perseguidores. Pero en Siria, los nazares se encontraron en un entorno político más complejo. Los estados cruzados a lo largo de la costa eran obviamente cristianos, pero también enemigos de las dinastías musulmanas que amenazaban las fortalezas nazares. Los nazares sirios demostraron una flexibilidad pragmática, a veces asesinando a líderes cruzados, a veces forjando alianzas temporales con ellos contra enemigos musulmanes comunes. En 1152, los nazares fidei estuvieron a punto de matar a un objetivo cristiano de gran importancia. Raimundo II, conde de Trípoli, fue apuñalado a muerte por asesinos. El asesinato fue solicitado por gobernantes musulmanes sirios que tenían conflictos con Raimundo. Esto demostró que se podían contratar los servicios nazares, que matarían a cristianos si con ello convenía a sus intereses o a los de sus aliados. La cuestión de si los asesinos actuaron alguna vez como mercenarios, matando por dinero en lugar de por motivos religiosos o políticos, y es objeto de debate entre los historiadores. Algunos asesinatos claramente sirvieron a los propios intereses de los nazares. Otros se llevaron a cabo como parte de alianzas, favores concedidos a socios políticos. No está claro si algunos de ellos fueron transactions puramente comerciales, aunque las fuentes medievales a veces acusaron a los nazarios de ser asesinos a sueldo. La filosofía se basa en los asesinatos. Nazares no era nihilista ni fatalista. Los nazares creen en la justicia, en el orden divino, en el triunfo final de la verdad. La violencia era un medio para alcanzar estos fines, no un fin en sí misma. Mataban para proteger a su comunidad, castigar a los opresores y crear un espacio para que su fe sobreviviera en un mundo hostil. Esto no confiere a los asesinatos moralidad según los estándares modernos de derechos humanos y Estado de Derecho, pero los contextualiza. Los nazares no eran excepcionalmente violentos para su época y lugar. En todo caso, su violencia era más contenida y discriminatoria que la de muchas potencias medievales. Simplemente usaban la violencia con mayor astucia, con mayor dramatismo, de maneras específicamente calculadas para maximizar el impacto psicológico y minimizar sus propias bajas. El legado de esta filosofía es complejo. Por un lado, los nazares demostraron que las tácticas asimétricas podían permitir que un grupo débil sobreviviera contra enemigos mucho más fuertes. Demostraron que el impacto psicológico de la violencia podía ser más importante que su magnitud. Estas son lecciones que las fuerzas irregulares modernas, tanto los movimientos de resistencia legítimos como las organizaciones terroristas, han aprendido. Por otro lado, los nazares mantuvieron límites éticos que muchos practicantes posteriores del asesinato y el terrorismo abandonaron. Atacaban a individuos específicos por razones específicas. Evitaban daño a los transeúntes. Aceptaban las consecuencias de sus acciones en lugar de negar la responsabilidad. Si estos límites hacen que sus acciones sean más aceptables, y es algo que usted debe juzgar. A medida que profundizamos en esta historia, levando estas preguntas filosóficas con nosotros, recuerda que los asesinos se ven a sí mismos como defensores de la verdad, protectores de su comunidad, fiel servidores de la voluntad de Dios. Sus enemigos los ven como herejes y asesinos. Ambas perspectivas contienen verdades parciales, y la verdad completa es más compleja de lo que ambos bandos reconocen. Capítulo 5. Las Cruzadas, Asesinos y Francos. La primera cruzada irrumpió en Oriente Medio en 1096, solo 6 años después de que Hassan-i Sabbah tomara el control de Alamut. Caballeros europeos, impulsados por el fervor religioso y las promesas de recompensas espirituales, forjan reinos a lo largo de la costa oriental del Mediterráneo, conquistando Jerusalén en 1099, tras una masacre que conmocionó incluso al mundo medieval por su brutalidad. Para los necesarios en Siria, las cruzadas crean tanto peligros como oportunidades. Los recién legados eran cristianos, herejes desde una perspectiva islámica, pero también enemigos de las dinastías musulmanas suníes que perseguían a los necesarios. Los cálculos políticos se volvieron complejos, y las posibles alianzas, cambiantes y temporales. Los nazares sirios se establecieron en las montañas de Jabal Siria a principios del siglo XII, adquiriendo fortalezas mediante una combinación de compras, capturas y alianzas. El líder sirio más famoso fue Rashid Allen, quien dirigió a los nazares sirios desde aproximadamente 1162 hasta 1193. Los cruzados europeos lo llamaban el anciano de la montaña, confundiéndolo con el líder de Alamut, sin comprender que las ramas siria y persa, aun relacionadas, operaban de forma relativamente independiente. Rashid Allen fue un hábil diplomático y estratega. Se desenvolvió en el complejo entorno político de la Siria cruzada, forjando alianzas y rompiéndolas cuando era necesario, siempre trabajando para proteger a su comunidad y extender su influencia. Bajo su liderazgo, los nazares sirios se convirtieron en una importante potencia regional a pesar de controlar solo unas pocas fortalezas y una población reducida. La interacción más famosa del asesino con los cruzados fue la de Conrado de Montferrat, líder del reino de Jerusalén. Conrado era un hábil comandante militar y un político astuto que había fortalecido la posición de los cruzados tras las conquistas de Saladino. Pero también tenía enemigos tanto entre cristianos como entre musulmanes. En 1192, dos asesinos disfrazados de monjes cristianos se acercaron a Conrado en las calles de Tai y lo apuñalaron hasta la muerte. Quien ordenó este asesinato sigue siendo un misterio histórico. Algunas fuentes afirman que Rashid Allen envió a los asesinos a petición de Saladino, y que Conrado había sido un obstáculo para las negociaciones de paz. Otros sugieren que Ricardo Corazón de León, rey de Inglaterra, y rival de Conrado por la influencia en los reinos cruzados, estuvo detrás del asesinato. Otros argumentan que los asesinos actuaron de forma independiente para eliminar una figura que consideraban una amenaza para sus intereses. Probablemente nunca sabremos la verdad. El asesinato de Conrado demuestra la capacidad del asesino para operar en territorio controlado por los cristianos, con la misma facilidad que en tierras musulmanas. Los fidei que asesinaron a Conrado se habían establecido por completo. Conocen las rutinas de la ciudad, Tienen acceso a su objetivo. Ese disfrazaban de monjes cristianos, y demostraban un profundo conocimiento de la sociedad y la religión de las cruzadas. Las crónicas de las cruzadas están repletas de referencias a los asesinos, aunque a menudo son extremadamente inexactas. Los escritores europeos, fascinados y horrorizados por la organización, la embellecieron y exageran con libertad. La historia del Jardín del Paraíso y los asesinos drogados, popularizada por Marco Polo en su libro de viajes del siglo XIII, probablemente es original en relatos cruzados confusos, mezclados con imaginación. Estos relatos nos hablan más de las ansiedades europeas que de la realidad nazarí. Los cruzados eran extranjeros en una tierra extraña, rodeados de culturas y religiones que no entendían. La idea de que fanáticos sacrificaran voluntariamente sus vidas por su fe era aterradora y incomprensible para muchos europeos, y requería una explicación mediante drogas y engaños en lugar de una fe genuina. Algunos líderes cruzados establecieron relaciones diplomáticas con los asesinos. Las consideraciones prácticas a veces prevalecen sobre la hostilidad religiosa. Los asesinos controlaban territorio estratégico y podían ser aliados útiles contra enemigos comunes. Asimismo, los estados cruzados podían ser aliados contra las potencias musulmanas sunitas que amenazaban tanto a los cristianos como a los ismaelitas nazaríes. Los caballeros templarios, la famosa orden religiosa militar, mantenían una interacción particularmente estrecha con los asesinos. Los templarios controlaban castillos cerca de los territorios de los asesinos, y ambos grupos a veces cooperaban, a veces luchaban, pero siempre se mantenían en contacto. Algunos historiadores especulan que los templarios se vieron influenciados por los métodos organizativos de los asesinos y las ideas religiosas esotéricas, aunque la evidencia de una influencia ideológica directa es limitada. Existe una extraña simetría histórica entre los templarios y los asesinos. Ambas eran organizaciones jerárquicas que exigían obediencia absoluta. Ambas combinaban la devoción religiosa con la eficacia militar. Ambas fueron acusadas por sus enemigos de creencias heréticas secretas. Ambas finalmente serían destruidas. Los templarios por los gobernantes europeos a principios del siglo XIV. Los asesinos por los mongols en el siglo XIII. Saladino, el famoso líder musulmán que recuperó Jerusalén de manos de los cruzados en 1187, mantuvo relaciones complicadas con los asesinos. Al principio de su carrera, intentó conquistar las fortalezas de los asesinos en Siria, considerándolas herejías y obstáculos políticos. Los asesinos respondieron con intentos de asesinato contra el propio Saladino. El primer intento, en 1175, casi tuvo éxito. Los asesinos se infiltraron en el campamento de Saladino y lo atacaron en su tienda. Saladino sobrevivió solo porque lavaba una cota de mulab bajo la ropa y porque sus guardias repelieron a los atacantes. Un segundo intento al año siguiente también fracasó. Pero estos encuentros forzados convencieron a Saladino de que la paz con los asesinos era preferable a la continuación del conflicto. Saladino y Rashid al-Insan llegaron a un acuerdo. Los asesinos dejarían de intentar matar a Saladino y Saladino dejaría de atacar las fortalezas de los asesinos. Este acuerdo práctico permitió a ambas partes centrarse en otras prioridades. Saladino en luchar contra los cruzados. Los asesinos en sobrevivir en una región peligrosa. Las relaciones de los asesinos con los cruzados ilustran un punto importante. Su conflicto no era principalmente con el cristianismo como tal, sino con cualquier poder que amenazara a su comunidad. Se aliaban con cristianos contra musulmanes, o con musulmanes contra cristianos, según las circunstancias. La ideología era importante, pero la supervivencia era primordial. Este pragmatismo a veces escandalizaba tanto a los observadores cristianos como a los musulmanes, quienes esperaban que los conflictos siguieran líneas religiosas claras. Pero los asesinos operaban en un entorno político complejo donde el enemigo de ayer podía ser el aliado de mañana, y viceversa. Hicieron lo necesario para proteger sus comunidades y fortalezas. Las Cruzadas trajeron a los asesinos a la conciencia europea de maneras que resonarían durante siglos. Los cruzados que regresaban contaban historias, a menudo exageradas o completamente inventadas, sobre los misteriosos asesinos en las fortalezas de las montañas. Estas historias, que mezclaban realidades, malentendidos y invenciones deliberadas, crean la imagen legendaria de los asesinos que ha persistido en el imaginario occidental. Fanáticos enloquecidos por las drogas, obedientes sin reservas a un amo siniestro dispuesto a matar a cualquiera por cualquier motivo. Esta imagen guarda poca semejanza con la realidad histórica, pero llegó a ser más influyente que la realidad. Cuando los escritores europeos de siglos posteriores querían hablar de asesinatos políticos, sociedades secretas o fanatismo, invocaban a los asesinos. El término asesino entró en las lenguas europeas como una palabra genérica para un asesino profesional, completamente desvinculado de sus orígenes en el Nasari, y es decir, el summarismo. La época de las Cruzadas representa la cúspide de la influencia de los asesinos, y el periodo en que se arraigaron en la memoria histórica occidental. Los Nazaris sirios, en particular, demostraron una notable adaptabilidad, sobreviviendo y prosperando en un entorno de guerra constante entre cristianos y musulmanes, compitiendo entre sí, manteniendo su independencia mediante una combinación de fuerza militar, ubicaciones estratégicas, y la constante amenaza de que oponerse a ellos significaba arriesgarse a ser asesinados. A medida que los reinos cruzados se derrumbaban gradualmente bajo las contraofensivas musulmanas en el siglo XIII, y las circunstancias políticas de la región seguían cambiando, los asesinos siguieron siendo un factor constante, aun pequeño, en la política de Oriente Medio. Pero una amenaza mayor que los cruzados o las dinastías sunitas se acercaba desde el este. La tormenta mongola que arrasó siglos de civilización islámica y casi puso fin a la existencia de los Ismails Nasari como comunidad organizada. Capítulo 6. Vida cotidiana y muerte. Dentro de la Orden de Asesinos. Tras los dramáticos asesinatos y las intrigas políticas, los nazarios vivían vidas normales. Los niños nacían, crecían y se educaban. La gente cultivaba, cocinaba, rezaba, celebraba matrimonios y lloraba muertes. Para comprender plenamente a los asesinos, debemos mirar más allá de los famosos fidei y examinar las comunidades que los apoyaban. La comunidad nazarí era jerárquica, organizada en niveles de conocimiento espiritual y autoridad. En la cima estaba el imán, el líder guiado por la divinidad. Para los nazis en Persia, el imán residía en Alamut, aunque su identidad a veces se mantenía en secreto por razones de seguridad. Por debajo del imán estaban los dares, misioneros y maestros que difundían la doctrina nazarí y supervisaban las comunidades locales. Más abajo en la jerarquía estaban los rafi, compañeros o simpatizantes, miembros comunes de la fe que apoyaban a la organización sin pertenecer a los círculos de conocimiento internos. En la base se encontraban los lasi, los no iniciados, personas que habían tenido contacto con el movimiento pero no habían sido plenamente aceptadas en sus misterios. Los fidei, los guerreros abnegados que perpetraban asesinatos, ocupaban un lugar especial. No estaban necesariamente en la cima de la jerarquía espiritual, pero ocupaban posiciones de honor y respeto. Su disposición al sacrificio los convertía en ejemplos de compromiso que otros admiraban y emulaban. La entrada a la comunidad nazarí comenzaba con la educación. Los jóvenes, a veces reclutados fuera de la comunidad, pero a menudo nacidos en familias nazares, reciben instrucción sistemática en las creencias Ismael. Esta instrucción se produce gradualmente, revelando el conocimiento en etapas a medida que el estudiante demostraba estar preparado para recibirlo. La enseñanza enfatizaba que los textos religiosos tenían significados externos obvios, accesibles para todos, y significados internos ocultos, accesibles solo para aquellos con un conocimiento especial y un desarrollo espiritual especial. Los estudiantes aprendían a mirar más allá de las interpretaciones literales para buscar un significado simbólico y filosófico más profundo en las escrituras y la ley religiosa. Este enfoque esotérico de la religión atrae a personas intelectualmente curiosas, insatisfechas con lo que consideran el rígido literalismo del Islam sunita ortodoxo. Permite una comprensión más profunda, acceso a un conocimiento secreto, conectado con una sabiduría ancestral transmitida por profetas y imams. Transformó la vida religiosa del mero seguimiento de reglas en un viaje de descubrimiento espiritual. La vida cotidiana en las fortalezas seguía ritmos regulares. Los miembros se despertaban antes del amanecer para la primera oración del día. Después de la oración, llegaba el desayuno, generalmente pan sencillo, de tilas, quizás queso o yogur. Luego venía el trabajo del día, entrenamiento para los guerreros, enseñanza para los eruditos, agricultura, artesanía o administración para los demás. Los niños de la comunidad asistían a escuelas dentro de las fortalezas. Aprendían a leer y escribir, estudiaban matemáticas y ciencias, y memorizaban textos religiosos. La educación era muy valorada. Los nazares creían que el conocimiento era poder, y que una comunidad educada era más fuerte que una ignorante. Para aquellos seleccionados para el entrenamiento como fide, la vida se volvía más intensa. El acondicionamiento físico era constante. Correr, escalar, armas, práctica. Los aprendices aprendieron a usar dagas con precisión little para golpear con rapidez, y precisión a objetivos vitales. Practicaron el disfraz y el engaño, aprendiendo a adaptar diferentes gestos, y patrones de habla para hacerse pasar por miembros de diversos grupos religiosos y sociales. La instrucción lingüística era importante. Un fide que operaba en territorios cruzados necesitaba un árabe funcional y posiblemente latino francés. Quien operaba entre Sunitas necesitaba conocer las oraciones, y prácticas Sunitas lo suficientemente bien como para evitar sospechas. El entrenamiento era exhaustivo, y formaba agentes capaces de desenvolverse eficazmente en diversos entornos. Pero el entrenamiento más importante era el psicológico y espiritual. El fedare necesitaba superar el miedo natural a la muerte. Acepta genuinamente que sacrificar su vida al servicio del imán era el mayor honor posible. Esto no se podía lograr con drogas en el lavado de cerebro. A pesar de las leyendas, requería una profunda convicción religiosa cultivada cuidadosamente durante años. El entrenamiento enfatizaba que la muerte al servicio del imán era un martirio que garantizaba la entrada inmediata al paraíso. El fidei meditaba sobre la muerte, contemplaba su significado, y aprendía a verla no como un final, sino como una transformación. Estudiaron los ejemplos de mártires anteriores, escuchando historias de fidei que habían muerto con valencia, manteniendo su fe y dignidad hasta el final. Las mujeres en las comunidades nazares ocupaban posiciones complejas. Al igual que las mujeres de todo el mundo islámico medieval, vivían bajo restricciones patriarcales, con sus vidas en gran medida confinadas al ámbito doméstico. Pero la teología nazare, con su énfasis en el conocimiento esotérico, ofrecía potencialmente más espacio para la participación religiosa de las mujeres que el Islam suní ortodoxo. Algunas mujeres alcanzaron puestos como maestras y transmisoras de conocimiento religioso. Educaban a los niños. Preservaban las tradiciones orales y participaban en debates religiosos dentro de los círculos femeninos. Algunas mujeres así convirtieron en misioneras que podían enseñar a otras mujeres. Estos roles, aunque limitados en comparación con las oportunidades de los hombres, representaban más de lo que las mujeres solían tener en las comunidades ortodoxas. Las familias vivían en apartamentos dentro de los complejos de la fortaleza, pequeñas habitaciones con mobiliario básico. La privacidad era limitada. La vida en comunidad. La gente conocía íntimamente a sus vecinos, para bien o para mal. Esta proximidad forzada creaba fuertes lazos comunitarios, pero también tensiones que requerían una gestión cuidadosa. Los alimentos provenían de múltiples fuentes. Fortresses maintained gardens and small fields wherever geography allowed. Traders brought supplies from valleys below. The community produced what it could. Cheese from goats, bread from grain, vegetables from gardens. During sieges, stored supplies became crucial, and rationing was strictly enforced. Medical care was sophisticated by medieval standards. The Nazarius valued knowledge, including medical knowledge. Fortress infirmaries were staffed by trained physicians who had studied ancient Greek and Islamic medical texts. They could set bones, treat wounds, prepare medicines from herbs and minerals. They couldn't cure many diseases, of course, but they offered the best care available in their era. Religious observance, structured daily life. The 5 daily prayers provided regular rhythm, calling people away from work or study to remember God. Friday was special with communal prayers and sermons. Religious festivals were celebrated with feasts and gatherings. These observances reinforced community identity and shared beliefs. Music and poetry were valued. Long winter evenings in mountain fortresses might be spent reciting poetry, both religious verses and secular works. Musicians played traditional instruments. The oud, a stringed instrument, the ney, a reed flute, drums. These cultural activities made life more than mere survival. They created beauty and meaning. Death was a regular visitor. People died from illness, from accidents in the dangerous mountain terrain, from wounds received in battles or assassinations. The community developed rituals for managing grief, for honoring the dead while consoling the living. Martyrs who died on missions were especially honored, their names remembered in prayers, their examples held up to inspire others. Not everyone in the Nazari community was a true believer. Some people were born into it and accepted its teachings, because they knew nothing else. Others joined for practical reasons, safety, community, material support. The leadership understood this and accepted it. What mattered was outward conformity and loyalty, not necessarily inner conviction, but for the true believers, for those who genuinely embraced Nazari theology and devoted themselves to the community. Life had a meaning and purpose that transcended ordinary concerns. They were part of something larger than themselves, participants in a cosmic struggle between truth and falsehood. Their daily activities, however mundane, contributed to a divine plan. This sense of purpose made hardships bearable and sacrifices meaningful. The contrast between the legendary assassins of popular imagination and the reality of actual Nazari communities is striking. The legends emphasize drug fanatics, sinister manipulation, exotic cruelty. The reality is more mundane. Communities of believers trying to practice their faith, raise their children, survive in a hostile world. They used violence, yes, but violence was a tool serving broader goals, not an end in itself. This more complete picture helps us understand how the Nari movement survived for nearly 2 centuries. Organizations based purely on violence and fear don't last that long, but communities bound by shared faith, mutual support, and common purpose can endure despite persecution and hardship. The Nazarius Miles were such a community, and understanding their daily lives helps us see them as fully human, not as the legendary monsters or heroes of exaggerated accounts. Chapter 7. The Victim's Perspective, Targets, and Terror. Now, let us shift our perspective and consider what it was like to be on the receiving end of Nazari attention to be marked for death by the assassins. The psychological experience of knowing you were targeted, of living under constant threat of sudden violent death, shaped the politics and personalities of an era. Imagine you are a high-ranking official in the Seljuk administration in 1100. You've been appointed to a position of authority in a Persian city. Part of your job involves suppressing heresy, including Islam. You've ordered arrests, confiscations of property, executions. You believe you're doing God's work, protecting Orthodox Islam from dangerous deviations. Then word reaches you. A Nizari agent was captured in a nearby city. Under torture, he confessed that he was sent to kill an official who had persecuted Nizaris. He wouldn't reveal who the target was, but you know you fit the description. Suddenly, every stranger looks suspicious. That merchant who just arrived in the city, is he really a merchant? The Sufi mystic preaching in the mosque, is he truly a holy man or a Fedari in disguise? Your guards are skilled, loyal, but they can't watch everywhere all the time. You vary your routines, trying to be unpredictable. You avoid public spaces where an attacker could approach easily. But you can't hide forever. Your position requires public appearances, meetings with delegations, attendance at mosques. Each public moment is an opportunity for an assassin. The fear becomes constant, a background anxiety coloring every experience. You sleep poorly, startling awake at slight sounds. You trust fewer people, wondering if even those close to you might be Nizari sympathizers. The stress affects your health, your personality, your ability to do your job effectively. And then perhaps you receive a message. It's delivered by a trusted servant who found it on his pillow one morning, though no one saw anyone enter his chambers. The message is simple. You have been judged. Your fate is sealed unless you cease persecuting the faithful. It's not signed, but you know who sent it. Now you have a choice. You can continue your anti-Nizari activities and accept the high probability of assassination, or you can relent, stop the persecutions, perhaps even quietly protect Nizaris in your jurisdiction. If you choose the latter, you've let fear dictate policy, but you'll probably live. If you choose the former, you're brave, but likely to end up stabbed in a mosque or marketplace. Your death gruesome and public. This was the calculation the Nizaris wanted their enemies to make. They couldn't fight armies or overthrow dynasties, but they could make powerful individuals reconsider their choices, could make persecution of Nizaris personally dangerous for the persecutors. It was asymmetric warfare at its most psychological. Not all targets were brutal persecutors. Some were chosen for purely political reasons, because they supported rivals or opposed Nizari interests in complex struggles for power. The Nizaris were practical. Assassination was a political tool, and sometimes political necessity outweighed moral considerations. Consider the perspective of someone like Nissim al-Mulk, the first major target of Hassan-i Sabbah's new strategy. Nissim was a brilliant administrator, author of an influential book on statecraft, patron of scholars and poets. He wasn't a sadistic persecutor. He was a statesman doing what he believed necessary to maintain order. His anti-Ismail policies were part of a broader effort to strengthen Seljuk authority and suppress various forms of dissent. From Nissim al-Mulk's perspective, the Nizaris were dangerous heretics, undermining the Islamic unity and political stability that allowed civilization to flourish. They rejected the legitimate Sunni caliphate, spread teachings that contradicted Orthodox belief, and owed allegiance to foreign leaders. Suppressing them wasn't cruelty. It was responsible governance. Yet, from the Nizari perspective, Nissim al-Mulk was an oppressor responsible for the deaths and suffering of countless Ismaili believers. His administrative competence made him more dangerous, not less, because he was effective at organizing persecution. His death was justice and self-defense, removing someone who posed an existential threat to the Nizari community. Both perspectives contain truth. This is the tragedy of the Nizari assassinations. They occurred in a context where genuine grievances and legitimate fears existed on multiple sides, where violence bred counter-violence in cycles difficult to break. The targets weren't always killed. Sometimes the message was enough. Prominent figures would receive warnings, would find daggers left on their pillows, or messages delivered in ways that demonstrated the assassins could reach them any time. The implicit message was clear. We could kill you now, but we're giving you a chance to reconsider your actions. This psychological warfare was often more effective than actual assassination. A dead martyr could inspire his followers, could be replaced by someone equally hostile, but a frightened leader who abandoned anti-Nizari policies was an ongoing victory, a demonstration that opposing the assassins carried costs not worth paying. The Nizaris became experts at calibrating their violence, using just enough to achieve political goals without provoking overwhelming retaliation. Too little violence, and they'd be ignored or attacked with impunity. Too much, and they'd unite their enemies in determination to destroy them completely. The balance required constant adjustment based on political circumstances. Some targets responded with increased security, surrounding themselves with guards, limiting their movements. This might keep them alive, but it also constrained their effectiveness and projected weakness. A leader who couldn't appear in public without massive security was a leader who had lost control, who lived in fear despite his power. Others sought accommodation with the Nizaris. They might not embrace Ismaili theology, but they could at least stop active persecution. They could enforce laws against heresy less zealously, could look the other way when Nizari missionaries operated in their territories. This pragmatic tolerance was precisely what the Nazis sought to encourage. The psychological impact extended beyond actual targets to anyone who might potentially become one. Governors, generals, clerics, and administrators throughout the Seljuk Empire and beyond knew about the assassins. They knew that vigorous opposition to the Nizars might result in a dagger to the heart. This knowledge influenced decisions at all levels, creating a climate of caution that benefited the Nizari cause. The families of targets also suffered. Imagine being the wife of a marked man, knowing that any day your husband might leave for work and never return, cut down in the street or in a mosque. Imagine being his children, growing up in a household shadowed by fear. The assassins' terror rippled outward, affecting not just their targets, but everyone connected to them. Yet, remarkably, some targets seemed to accept their fate with equanimity. Medieval Islamic culture emphasized acceptance of divine will, the belief that everyone's death is predetermined and will occur at the appointed time regardless of precautions. Some marked men reasoned that if God willed them to die by an assassin's dagger, no amount of guards could prevent it. They continued their work, accepting the risk as part of their duty. This fatalism could be empowering, freeing people from paralyzing fear, but it was also a kind of surrender, an admission that the assassins had achieved their goal of making powerful people believe that opposition was futile. Whether dying with dignity or living in fear, the targets had lost the psychological battle. The victim's perspective reveals the assassin's effectiveness. They transformed assassination from mere murder into psychological warfare, using carefully targeted violence to influence the calculations of the powerful. They proved that a small, weak community could defend itself against much stronger enemies, not through conventional military power, but through making opposition individually dangerous for specific decision-makers. This strategy's legacy is profoundly ambiguous. It demonstrated that asymmetric tactics could be effective, that the weak weren't necessarily powerless. But it also normalized political murder, made assassination a standard tool of statecraft in a region where it remained common for centuries. Whether the Nizari's innovations represent creative resistance or dangerous precedent depends on your perspective and values. Chapter 8. Legends and Myths. Marco Polo and the Paradise Garden. In 1271, a teenage Venetian merchant named Marco Polo set out with his father and uncle on a journey that would take him to China and make him famous. On his return, he dictated an account of his travels that became one of the most widely read books of the Middle Ages. Among the many wonders he described was his account of the Old Man of the Mountain and his assassins. According to Marco Polo, the Old Man of the Mountain maintained a hidden garden designed to resemble paradise, with flowing streams, beautiful pavilions, fruits and flowers, and lovely maidens. Young men would be drugged and brought to this garden while unconscious. When they woke, they believed they had been transported to heaven. After allowing them to enjoy the garden's pleasures for several days, the old man would drug them again and remove them. When they woke back in the ordinary world, the old man would tell them they had experienced paradise and could return permanently if they died, carrying out his orders. Convinced they had glimpsed heaven and desperate to return, These young men would then carry out any assassination commanded, fearlessly embracing death because they believed it would transport them back to paradise. This story is almost certainly false. Marco Polo never visited Alamut or any other assassin fortress. By the time of his journey, the Mongols had already destroyed them. He was repeating stories he heard, probably from Persian informants whose accounts mixed fact with local legend and anti-Aseli propaganda. But the tale was so compelling that it became the dominant Western understanding of the assassins for centuries. The story appealed to medieval European audiences for several reasons. It explained something they found incomprehensible. How could men willingly sacrifice their lives for religious beliefs? European Christians understood martyrdom in defense of Christianity, but Islam was seen as a false religion, so Muslim martyrdom seemed to require special explanation. Drugs and trickery made sense of what otherwise seemed mysterious. The Paradise Garden story also reinforced European prejudices about Islam and the Orient. It portrayed Muslims as sensual, deceptive, manipulative. The emphasis on beautiful women and physical pleasures fit stereotypes about Islamic paradise, being carnal rather than spiritual. The old man of the mountain became a stock villain, the archetypal evil Oriental sorcerer. But where did the legend originate? Probably in a combination of sources. The Nazarenes did believe in paradise and martyrdom. That part was true. Their fortresses did contain gardens. The archaeological evidence confirms this. Some Nazari fortresses cultivated plants for medicinal purposes, including possibly plants with psychoactive properties used in medical treatment. Anti-Ismail propaganda from Sunni Muslim sources emphasized the supposedly blasphemous and heretical nature of Nazari beliefs. Some accounts accuse the Nazaris of using trickery and deception to recruit followers, claiming they led people astray with false promises. These accusations were standard religious polemic, but they may have included garbled references to Nazari initiation practices and esoteric teaching methods. The word assassin itself contributes to mythologization. The term supposedly derives from hashishin, meaning users of hashish, the cannabis-based drug. This etymology suggests drug use was central to assassin identity. However, the actual derivation is more complex and less certain. Some scholars argue assassin comes from asas, meaning guardians or foundation, or from other Arabic roots unrelated to drugs. Whether or not the Nazir used hashish recreationally or in religious contexts is unknown. Medieval Islamic society did know about hashish. It was used medically and sometimes recreationally despite religious prohibitions. It's possible some Nazaris used it, but there's no reliable evidence that it was central to their practices or used to create obedient killers. The problem with the drug and deception theory is that it doesn't explain assassin effectiveness. Drugged, deceived people don't make good spies and assassins. The Fadi demonstrated too much intelligence, adaptability, and long-term planning to be manipulated dupes. They had to establish cover identities, maintain them for months or years, adapt to changing circumstances, wait patiently for the right moment to strike. This requires mental clarity, not drug-induced confusion. Modern historians largely reject the Paradise Garden story as myth. Archaeological excavations at Alamut have found no evidence of such a garden. More importantly, contemporary Muslim sources, including accounts hostile to the Nazaris, don't mention it. If such a garden existed, the Nazis' many enemies would surely have described it in their anti-Ismaili writings. The absence of such descriptions suggests the story was a later invention. So what did motivate the Fidi? Almost certainly genuine religious conviction, carefully cultivated through education and indoctrination. The Nazari system of hierarchical knowledge, with secrets gradually revealed to worthy initiates, created a powerful sense of belonging and purpose. Young men raised in the system, taught from childhood that they were part of an elect group defending ultimate truth against falsehood, would naturally develop absolute commitment. The promise of paradise for martyrs didn't require tricks. Islam, like Christianity, teaches that those who die defending the faith enter paradise immediately. The Nazaris simply emphasized this teaching, making martyrdom central to their religious culture. Combined with the social prestige accorded to Fedari and the very real persecution the community faced, this created motivation sufficient to produce the fearless warriors European observers found. so incomprehensible. Other legends accumulated around the assassins. They were said to have unlimited wealth, hidden treasures in their mountain fortresses. They supposedly had magical powers, could appear and disappear at will, could kill from a distance. Their leader could read minds, could see the future, possessed knowledge unknown to ordinary mortals. These legends served purposes for those who spread them. They explained assassin successes. Obviously, such effective killers must have supernatural help. They justified fear. One should be afraid of enemies with magical powers. They made good stories. Audiences loved tales of mysterious, powerful organizations operating in the shadows. But legends also obscured reality, making it harder to understand the actual Nasari-Ismaili community and their genuine achievements. The real assassins were remarkable enough, without embellishment. They created an organization that survived for nearly 2 centuries in a hostile environment. They developed innovative tactics that allowed the weak to confront the powerful. They preserved learning and culture during violent times. They demonstrated absolute commitment to their beliefs and community. These genuine achievements deserve recognition and study. The legends, while entertaining and culturally significant in their own right, distract from the historical reality. They turned the Nazaris into cartoon villains or superhuman bogeymen, erasing their humanity and the complex motivations that actually drove them. As Western interest in the Orient increased during the 18th and 19th centuries, the assassin legends were endlessly recycled and elaborated. Romantic poets and novelists used them as exotic settings and characters. The assassins appeared in adventure stories, operas, and paintings, always portrayed as mysterious, dangerous, fascinating, other. In the 20th century, video games, films, and novels continued reimagining the assassins, now usually completely divorced from historical reality. The Assassin's Creed video game franchise, while entertaining, presents a purely fictional version bearing little resemblance to actual Nasari-Ismailis. This is fine as entertainment, but it further embeds false impressions in popular consciousness. The challenge for anyone studying the actual history of the assassins is separating 9 centuries of legend, propaganda, and artistic license from the more modest but still remarkable historical reality. The Nasaris were people, not legends. They lived, loved, feared, hoped, believed, and died like all humans. Their story is compelling enough without the paradise garden, the hashish, the magical powers. We do them and ourselves a disservice by preferring comforting myths to complex truths. As you drift deeper into this night's exploration, let the legends fade and the reality emerge. Mountain fortresses filled with scholars and warriors. Communities bound by faith and persecution. Individuals making difficult choices in impossible circumstances. This is the true story of the assassins. More human and more interesting than any legend. Chapter 9. The Mongol Storm. Destruction and Survival. In 1206, in the steppes of Central Asia, a gathering of tribal leaders proclaimed Tujin as Genghis Khan, the universal ruler. This moment marked the beginning of the largest contiguous land empire in human history, an empire built on unprecedented military effectiveness and equally unprecedented brutality. For the Nazarius Melis, the Mongol conquests would mean catastrophe. The Mongols burst into the Islamic world in the 1220s, conquering Central Asian cities with horrifying efficiency. Their military tactics emphasized mobility, psychological warfare, and total destruction of resistance. Cities that surrendered were sometimes spared, though their populations were still plundered. Cities that resisted were annihilated, their populations massacred, their buildings destroyed, their fields salted, so nothing would grow. At first, the Nazaris probably viewed the Mongol conquests as distant problems. Alamut and the other Persian fortresses had survived Seljuk sieges and numerous other military challenges. Their mountain strongholds seemed impregnable, but the Mongols were unlike any enemy the Nazaris had faced before. After Genghis Khan's death in 1227, his empire was divided among his sons and grandsons. Hulagu Khan, Genghis's grandson, was given responsibility for conquering Persia and the Middle East. Hulagu was intelligent, cultured, and completely ruthless. He understood that his grandfather's military tactics worked because they instilled terror so profound that most enemies surrendered without fighting. Hulagu began his Persian campaign in 1256. He systematically conquered or coerced the submission of various Persian principalities and dynasties. Many surrendered, understanding that resistance meant death. But Hulagu had specific targets in mind: the Abbasid Caliphate in Baghdad, which he saw as a political threat, and the Nizari Ismailis, whom he viewed as troublesome heretics and potential sources of instability. The Nizari Grandmaster at Alamut was Ala Alan Muhammad, called Allah Alan III. He was young, having inherited leadership in 1255, and he faced an impossible situation. The Mongol army approaching Alamut was enormous, including not just Mongol cavalry, but Chinese siege engineers with sophisticated equipment. More importantly, Hulagu had made clear that resistance would be punished with total extermination. Alan III tried negotiation. He sent ambassadors to Hulagu with gifts and promises of submission. But Hulagu's terms were harsh. Alan must personally come to the Mongol camp, must surrender all Nizari fortresses, must order his followers to submit completely to Mongol authority. These terms meant the effective end of Nizari independence. What happened next is recorded in contemporary chronicles, though details vary. Allah Alini apparently agreed to Hulagu's terms and left Alamut to visit the Mongol camp. He may have believed he could negotiate better terms in person, or he may have simply accepted that resistance was hopeless. He was received with apparent honor, but was essentially a prisoner. Meanwhile, Mongol forces surrounded Alamut. The fortress garrison, despite losing their leader, initially refused to surrender. They knew the fortress had never been taken, that its defenses had withstood centuries of attacks. But the Mongols were patient and had siege equipment superior to anything the Seljuks had ever deployed. The siege lasted several months. Mongol engineers constructed siege towers and catapults. They blocked supply routes, preventing food and water from reaching the fortress. They sent messages that resistance was futile, that Alinthrid had ordered surrender, that continued fighting would only result in everyone's death. Eventually, in December 1256, Alamut surrendered. The Mongols entered the fortress and methodically destroyed it. They demolished the fortifications, burned the buildings, and most tragically destroyed the famous library. Thousands of manuscripts representing centuries of accumulated knowledge in philosophy, science, religion, and literature were burned. A few texts were saved, either taken by fleeing Nazaris or preserved by Mongol officials who recognized their value. But the vast majority of Alamut's intellectual treasure was lost forever. The Nizaris at Alamut were spared wholesale massacre, perhaps because they had surrendered rather than resisting to the end. But Alan was not so lucky. After the fortress's fall, Hulagu sent him on a mission to order the surrender of remaining Nizari fortresses. Alauddin III complied, traveling to various strongholds and ordering their submission. Once all the major fortresses had been secured, Hulagu had Alauddin Dashri killed, probably in 1257. Some sources say he was executed. Others suggest he was simply murdered quietly. The other Persian Nizari fortresses fell in succession over the following months. Some surrendered after Alamut's fall, understanding that continued resistance was pointless. A few held out longer, but eventually yielded to Mongol siege tactics or direct assault. By late 1257, the Nizari state in Persia had been completely destroyed. Hulagu then turned to Baghdad, conquering and sacking the Abbasid capital. In 1258, the caliph was executed, reportedly rolled in a carpet, and trampled by horses. The city was thoroughly looted, its population massacred. The House of Wisdom, another great medieval library, was destroyed. The Tigris River supposedly ran black with ink from the manuscripts thrown into it. The destruction of the Nizari state and the abased caliphate marked the end of an era in Islamic history. Institutions that had existed for centuries were swept away in a few years of Mongol campaigns. The political and cultural landscape of the Middle East was fundamentally transformed, but the Nizarius Melis as a religious community survived. Many fled before the Mongol advance, scattering to India, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and Syria. They went underground, practicing their faith in secret, no longer a political power, but still a living religious tradition. Some Nizaris reached accommodation with Mongol authorities, accepting protected minority status under the new order. The Syrian Nasari fortresses initially escaped destruction. Syria was farther from the Mongol heartland, and Hulagu's forces didn't reach it until later. Mongol expansion into Syria was contested by the Mamluks, the military slave dynasty that had taken power in Egypt. The Mamluks defeated Mongol forces at the Battle of Angelut in 1260, stopping Mongol expansion and saving Syria and Egypt from conquest. The Syrian Nicaeris negotiated with the Mamluks and eventually surrendered their fortresses peacefully in the early 1270s. Unlike the Persian communities, the Syrian Nicaeris weren't massacred or scattered. They were absorbed into Mamluk Syria as a tolerated religious minority. The fortresses were taken over by Mamluk governors, but the Nizari communities in the surrounding area survived, maintaining their distinctive religious identity. The Mongol destruction of Alamut and the Persian Nizari state was a catastrophe from which the organization never recovered politically. The state within a state, the network of fortresses, and the military power that had made the assassins a significant political factor was gone. The organization that had frightened sultans and survived crusader invasions was destroyed. Yet in a deeper sense, the Nizari survived. The faith persisted. Communities in India, Central Asia, and Syria maintained Ismaili traditions and transmitted them to new generations. The line of imams continued, though forced into hiding and operating in secret. The theological and philosophical teachings that had defined Nizari identity survived in the manuscripts that had been saved and in oral traditions passed down through families. The destruction of Alamut and the Persian fortresses also meant that much of what we know about the Nizari Isles comes from hostile sources, from Sunni chroniclers and European observers who had no sympathy for Nizari beliefs. The Nizaris' own accounts, their internal records and theological texts were mostly lost in the flames that consumed Alamut's library. This makes reconstructing their actual beliefs and practices difficult, forcing historians to separate propaganda from reality, legend from fact. The Mongol conquests remind us how fragile human achievements can be, how quickly centuries of accumulated knowledge can vanish. The Nizaris had built something remarkable, a community based on learning and faith, fortresses that seemed invincible, an organization that had survived against great odds. But military power ultimately defeated them, as it has defeated so many others throughout history. The mountain fortresses fell, the libraries burned, and an era ended in smoke and blood. Chapter 10. After the Fall. Legacy and Continuation. The fall of Alamut in 1256 marked the end of the Nizari Ismailis as a significant political power. But it didn't end the Nizari community or tradition. In fact, the story of how Nizari Ismailism survived and eventually thrived illustrates remarkable resilience and adaptability. After the Mongol conquests, surviving Nizaris scattered throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Many fled to Afghanistan and Central Asia, establishing communities in remote mountain valleys beyond Mongol reach. Others traveled to the Indian subcontinent, where various Muslim dynasties offered possibilities for safety. Still others remained in Persia and Syria, accepting subordinate status and practicing their faith quietly. The line of imams continued, though in hiding. The Nasari imam after Ala Muhammad's death was his son Rukn al-Qurra, who survived initially, but was eventually executed by the Mongols. After his death, the imam's identity became secret, known only to close followers. This period of concealment, called Satra, lasted for generations, with each imam passing the leadership to his successor in secret. The broader community, sometimes not even knowing who their spiritual leader was. This underground existence required significant adaptation. The elaborate hierarchy and fortress network were gone. The public political role was abandoned. The Nizaris became what they had been in earlier times, a religious community defined by distinctive theological beliefs and practices, not by political power or military effectiveness. In India, Nizari communities established themselves in Gujarat, Sindh, and other regions. They often worked as traders, developing commercial networks that connected India with Central Asia and the Middle East. Some rose to positions of influence in various Indian courts, serving as administrators or advisors. The Indian Nizars, called Khjas, developed distinctive practices blending his theology with local cultural elements. In Central Asia, Nizari communities survived in the mountainous regions of Badakhshan and adjacent areas. These remote populations maintained their traditions, with minimal outside interference, living as farmers and herders in isolated valleys. Their relative isolation helped preserve distinctive Nizari practices that had been lost elsewhere. In Syria, the Nizari community, though no longer controlling fortresses, remained identifiable and maintained their traditions. They lived primarily in villages in the mountains, farming and practicing various crafts. The Syrian Nizaris, sometimes called assassins by outsiders who didn't understand that the term referred to a historical phase, not a permanent identity, maintained connections with other Ismaili communities. In Persia, surviving Nizaris had to be extremely cautious. Persia's Mongol rulers were gradually converted to Islam, but to Sunni Islam, which viewed Ismailis with continued hostility. Nazaris practiced taqiyya, religiously sanctioned concealment of one's true faith when under threat. They might attend Sunni mosques, perform Sunni prayers in public, while privately maintaining their Ismaili beliefs and passing them to their children in secret. The imams themselves moved periodically, living in different cities and regions, their identities known to only a few trusted followers. This concealment was necessary for survival, but it also created continuity problems. How could followers maintain connection to an imam whose identity and location were secret? The answer involved trusted intermediaries, daisies who maintained contact with the imam and transmitted his guidance to the community. Over centuries, the hidden imams gradually became less hidden. As political circumstances changed, as the immediate threat of persecution faded, the imams could operate more openly. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Nizari imams were living openly in Persia, though still maintaining discretion and avoiding actions that might provoke hostility. A crucial moment came in the mid-9th century. Hassan Ali Shah, the Nizari imam, had conflicts with Persian authorities over land and power. After an unsuccessful rebellion against the government, he fled Persia in 1841. He eventually settled in India under British protection, establishing his headquarters in Bombay, now Mumbai. The British colonial government, operating on principles of religious toleration and finding the Nizari Ismailis useful allies, provided security and recognition. Hassan Ali Shah took the title Akin, meaning lord or master, which would become the title by which subsequent Nizari imams were known. The Akans, operating from British India and later independent India, gradually transformed Nizari Ismailism into a global religious community with institutions, schools, and social service organizations. The current Akin, Shah Karim al-Yazini, is the 49th Nizari imam, a direct descendant of Hassan-i Sabbah's imams through over 9 centuries. He leads a community estimated at 15 million worldwide, concentrated in India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Syria, East Africa, and increasingly in North America and Europe. Modern Nizari Ismailism bears little obvious resemblance to the medieval assassins. The Akin Development Network operates schools, hospitals, and economic development programs in the developing world. The community emphasizes education, pluralism, and peaceful coexistence with other faiths. The idea of assassination as a religious tool is completely abandoned, seen as a historical phase that ended 8 centuries ago. Yet theological continuity persists. The Nizari Ismailis still believe in the imamate, in the divine guidance of Ali's descendants. They still practice esoteric interpretation of Islamic teachings. They still maintain distinctive rituals and beliefs that set them apart from Sunni and 12 Shia Muslims. The community that Hassan Sabbah helped define in the 11th century still exists, transformed but continuous. The architectural legacy is mixed. Most of the medieval fortresses lie in ruins. Alamut can still be visited. It's a tourist site in Iran. The ruined walls and chambers speaking of vanished glory. Some Syrian fortresses also survive as ruins. These sites attract historians, archaeologists, and tourists, people drawn by the legendary reputation of the assassins. The intellectual legacy is harder to trace given the destruction of most primary sources. We know the Nazis valued philosophy and learning, but most of their texts are lost. A few manuscripts survived, preserved in libraries or carried away by refugees. Modern scholars study these fragments, trying to reconstruct Nizari thought and practices, but huge gaps remain. Questions we can't answer because the evidence burned with Alamut's library. The cultural legacy is substantial, though often based on myth rather than reality. The word assassin entered multiple languages, its etymology debated, but its meaning clear. The image of the assassin, the devoted killer serving a mysterious master, became a cultural archetype. Secret societies, conspiracy theories, adventure stories, all draw on the assassin legend. This cultural legacy is problematic for modern Nari Smileys. They're heirs to a tradition that's been mythologized and sensationalized, often inaccurately. The community has worked to correct misconceptions, emphasizing that historical Nazaris were more than just killers, that their community valued learning and culture, that the assassinations were a defensive strategy adopted in desperate circumstances, not the defining feature of their identity. The Nazari survival story is remarkable. A small religious minority persecuted by powerful enemies, scattered by Mongol conquests, forced underground for generations, somehow maintained their identity and traditions. They adapted to new circumstances, preserved what was essential while changing what was necessary, and eventually emerged as a thriving global community. This survival suggests that religious communities can be more resilient than political and military organizations. Alamut fell. The fortress network was destroyed. The assassinations ended. But the faith survived because it meant something to people, because it provided identity and community, because parents transmitted it to children across generations despite danger and difficulty. The nefarious Smileys after the fall of Alamut demonstrate that endings aren't always complete, that what seems destroyed can sometimes survive in altered form, that communities defined by shared beliefs and identities can endure through centuries of change and persecution. The organization called the Assassins ended in 12th Wage 6. The Nazarius Smiley community continues today, living testimony that some things are harder to kill than fortresses and armies. Chapter 11. Historical Impact. Assassination as Strategy. The Nazarius Smileys didn't invent assassination. Political murder has existed as long as politics, but they systematized it, transformed it from individual act into organizational strategy, demonstrated its effectiveness as a weapon for the weak against the powerful. This innovation, if it can be called that, has had profound and troubling consequences, extending to the present day. Before the assassins, political murder occurred, but usually in the context of palace coups, succession disputes, or personal revenge. It was secretive, shameful, something plotted in shadows and denied publicly. Hassan-i Sabbah made it public, dramatic, an acknowledged tool of political influence. The Fadi didn't hide their affiliations, they proclaimed them. The Nazari leadership didn't deny responsibility. They took credit, using successful assassinations as propaganda, demonstrating their power and reach. This openness transformed the political calculus. When assassination is secret, potential targets can pretend it won't happen to them, can maintain the fiction of security. When it's public and acknowledged, when everyone knows that opposing Group X might result in assassination by Group X, then the threat becomes an ever-present factor in decision-making. The assassins demonstrated that asymmetric tactics could be remarkably effective. A small, poorly resourced community couldn't defeat the Seljuk Empire in conventional warfare. They had no chance in battles, no hope of conquering territories, but they didn't need to win battles. They needed to make Seljuk officials reconsider their anti-Ismaili policies, to make persecution more costly than toleration. Political assassination achieved this at remarkably low cost. Training a Fida required resources certainly, but far less than maintaining an army. Losing a Fida in a successful assassination was tragic but acceptable, whereas losing hundreds of soldiers in a failed battle would have been catastrophic. The return on investment measured in political impact per unit of resources expended was extraordinarily high. This lesson wasn't lost on others. Throughout subsequent centuries, various groups facing powerful enemies adopted similar tactics. The precise influence of the assassins on later practitioners of political murder is hard to trace, but the basic principle they demonstrated, that targeted killing could be an effective political tool for the weak, has been repeatedly rediscovered. The problem, of course, is that assassination normalizes violence, lowers barriers against killing for political purposes, creates cycles of revenge that spiral out of control. The Seljuks responded to Nizari assassinations, with persecutions and military campaigns against Nizari communities. The Nizaris responded with more assassinations. Each side could justify its violence as defensive, as necessary response to the other's aggression. This pattern recurs throughout history. One side adopts assassination or terrorism. The other responds with repression or counter-violence. The first side claims this proves their violence was necessary and justified. The cycle continues, each iteration potentially more brutal than the last. The Nizaris and Seljuks were trapped in such a cycle, unable or unwilling to find paths to coexistence that didn't involve violence. The Nazarist use of assassination also raises questions about the ethics of asymmetric warfare. When a weak group facing a powerful enemy cannot prevail through conventional means, what tactics are acceptable? Most modern ethical frameworks condemn assassination as murder, as violation of human rights and rule of law. But these frameworks assume functioning legal systems that protect minorities from persecution, assumptions that often don't hold in practice. If a community faces existential threats, if the legal system offers no protection, if peaceful options have been exhausted, does assassination become morally acceptable? The Nizaris would have said yes, arguing they were defending their community against genocidal persecution. Their opponents would have said no, arguing that heresy and rebellion justified suppression. Both sides believed they were acting righteously. The Nazarist legacy in this regard is deeply ambiguous. They showed that the weak aren't necessarily powerless, that clever strategy can compensate for material weakness, that courage and commitment can achieve results military force cannot. These are potentially empowering lessons for any oppressed group. But they also showed that violence, once adopted, becomes hard to control, that tactics justified as defensive can become ends in themselves, that the line between resistance and terrorism is often unclear. The question of whether the Nizaris were terrorists is anachronistic. The concept of terrorism as we understand it didn't exist in the medieval period, but applying modern definitions retrospectively, we might say they practiced something like terrorism, violence against non-combatants, government officials, not soldiers, for political purposes, intended to intimidate broader populations. Yet, they also showed restraint many modern terrorist groups lack. They targeted specific individuals for specific reasons, avoided mass casualty attacks, and maintained ethical boundaries, even while engaging in political murder. The intellectual impact of the assassins is hard to measure because so many of their texts were lost. We know they contributed to Islamic philosophy, particularly in areas of esoteric theology and religious epistemology. Nizari thinkers developed sophisticated theories about the nature of religious knowledge, the relationship between exoteric and esoteric truth, the role of the imam as interpreter of divine will. These ideas influenced broader Islamic thought, though tracing specific influences is difficult given limited sources. The Nizaris also demonstrated that religious minorities could maintain distinctive identities and practices despite persecution and pressure to conform. They developed strategies for survival, the fortress system providing secure bases, the hierarchical structure maintaining organizational discipline, the esoteric teachings, creating strong community bonds, the willingness to use violence, defending the community when necessary. This combination of spiritual identity, social organization, and strategic flexibility enabled survival for nearly 2 centuries in hostile environments. Later, religious minorities facing persecution sometimes adopted similar strategies. Secret societies, underground churches, persecuted sects of various kinds have used concealment, strong internal bonds, and willingness to sacrifice for the community. Whether they consciously borrowed from the assassin model or independently developed similar approaches is often unclear, but the patterns recur. The Nazarist military legacy is mixed. Their fortress system was eventually defeated, though it took the Mongols, history's most effective military force, to accomplish this. Their tactical innovations in assassination were effective but limited. Ultimately, they couldn't achieve more than defensive survival, couldn't overthrow their enemies or establish lasting security. The assassination strategy worked well enough to prevent the community's complete destruction, but not well enough to win genuine victory. Perhaps that's the most important lesson. Asymmetric tactics can help the weak survive and resist, but they rarely enable genuine victory. They can make the powerful pay costs for their actions, but they can't fundamentally alter power relationships. The Nizari survived as a religious community, but lost their political and military independence. Their survival was real, but limited, a kind of victory, but also a kind of defeat. The historical impact of the assassins thus extends across multiple dimensions. Tactical innovations in asymmetric warfare, demonstration of assassination's political utility, preservation of religious minority identity despite persecution, contribution done to Islamic philosophy and theology, and creation of legends that shaped cultural imagination centuries later. Some of this legacy is positive, some troubling, some simply fascinating. All of it suggests that this small medieval community's impact far exceeded what their limited numbers and resources might have predicted. Chapter 12. Comparative Perspectives. Assassins and Others. The Nizari Ismailis weren't the only group in history to use targeted killing as a political strategy. Comparing their methods and motivations with other assassin organizations reveals both unique features and common patterns. Tonight, let's briefly examine several other groups that have used assassination. Understanding the Nizari assassins in comparative context. The Sicaria active in 1st century Judea were Jewish zealots opposed to Roman occupation. They operated in crowds using short daggers called CK, from which their name derives, to stab Roman officials and Jewish collaborators, then melting back into the crowd before authorities could react. Like the Nizari assassins 6 centuries later, the Sicarii used public assassination to demonstrate their reach and intimidate their enemies. Like the Nizaris, they were driven by religious conviction and resistance to foreign rule. And like the Nizaris, they were ultimately destroyed by overwhelming military force when the Romans sacked Jerusalem in 70 CE. The Thuggee operating in India from roughly the 13th to 19th centuries were organized groups of highway robbers who strangled travelers as ritual sacrifices to the goddess Kali. The Thuggee have sometimes been compared to the assassins because both were allegedly secret societies using murder as religious practice. But the comparison is misleading. The Thuggee killed for profit disguised as religious duty, targeting random travelers rather than specific political figures. They lack the assassin's political goals and theological sophistication. Moreover, much of what everyone knows about the Thuggee is British colonial propaganda exaggerated or invented to justify British rule in India. The Japanese ninja, romanticized in modern popular culture, were regular warriors and spies in feudal Japan employed by various warlords for espionage, sabotage, and assassination. Unlike the assassins, ninja weren't a unified organization or religious community. They were practitioners of specific military skills, hired professionals rather than devoted believers. Some worked as farmers when not employed for covert missions. The ninjas' tactical methods included some similarities to the assassins: stealth, disguise, patient waiting for the right moment. But the underlying motivations and organizational structures were entirely different. The Irish Republican Army and other paramilitary organizations in the Irish independence struggle used assassination against British officials, police, and alleged collaborators in the early 20th century. Like the Nizaris, these groups were religious and ethnic minorities using asymmetric tactics against a more powerful occupier. Like the Nazaresis, they justified violence as defensive, as necessary for community survival. The ethical and political debates about IRA violence mirror, in some ways, debates about the assassins. Were they freedom fighters or terrorists? Was their violence justified by circumstances or inherently wrong? The answers depend on one's perspective. The anarchist movement of the late 19th and early 20th centuries used assassination as propaganda of the deed, killing monarchs, presidents, and officials to inspire revolution and demonstrate the vulnerability of state power. Anarchist assassins killed Tsar Alexander II of Russia, President William McKinley of the United States, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, King Umberto the Vernes of Italy, and many others. Unlike the Nizaris, most anarchist assassins operated individually or in small groups, not as part of a large hierarchical organization. Their motivations were ideological rather than specifically religious, though both groups shared absolute commitment to their beliefs. Modern terrorist organizations sometimes draw comparisons to the assassins, though usually superficially. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and similar groups use suicide attacks and target political figures, which superficially resembles Nazari tactics. But crucial differences exist. The Nazaris targeted specific individuals for specific political reasons. Modern terrorists often engage in mass casualty attacks, killing dozens or hundreds of civilians. The Nazaris accepted capture after assassinations. Modern terrorists usually try to maximize body counts and terrorize general populations. The Nazaris maintain theological sophistication and ethical boundaries. Modern terrorist ideologies often embrace nihilistic violence. The comparison sometimes made between assassins and modern terrorists is thus mostly misleading, more propaganda than analysis. Intelligence agencies and terrorism experts sometimes invoke the assassins when discussing motivations of suicide attackers, arguing that historical precedent exists for religious fanatics willingly dying for their cause. But this oversimplifies both the historical nearists and modern extremists, erasing crucial distinctions between targeted political assassination and mass casualty terrorism. State-sponsored assassination programs offer another comparison. Intelligence agencies throughout history have eliminated foreign leaders, dissident, and threats through covert murder. These programs use methods sometimes similar to the assassins: patient intelligence gathering, careful planning, agents willing to risk their lives. But state assassination programs operate with resources and protections the Nazis never had. Their agents aren't religious martyrs, but professional operatives. Their motivations are national interest rather than theological conviction. What all these comparisons reveal is that assassination as political tool recurs throughout history in various cultural contexts. The specific details vary. The justifications differ, the effectiveness fluctuates, but the basic pattern repeats. A group or organization decides that killing specific individuals serves their political or religious goals, develops methods for doing so, and implements those methods despite ethical and practical obstacles. The Nazarist uniqueness lies not in using assassination, which many groups have done, but in several specific features. The theological sophistication justifying violence. The long organizational survival despite persecution. The fortress-based quasi-state supporting assassination campaigns. The training system producing highly effective operatives. And the dramatic public nature of assassinations maximizing psychological impact. No other pre-modern organization combined all these elements as successfully as the Nazaris did. This combination made them historically significant and helps explain their continuing fascination. They demonstrated what a small, committed, well-organized group could achieve despite overwhelming opposition. They showed that intelligence and strategy could sometimes compensate for material weakness. They proved that ideas and commitment could be as powerful as armies and gold. But comparative analysis also reveals the limitations of the assassin model. Like other groups using assassination, the Nazaris couldn't translate tactical successes into strategic victory. They survived but didn't triumph. They influenced politics but couldn't control it. They frightened their enemies but couldn't defeat them. Ultimately, overwhelming force destroyed their political organization, though their religious community survived. This pattern recurs. Asymmetric tactics provide advantages for weak groups, but they rarely enable fundamental transformations of power structures. The Sicarii were destroyed. The anarchists were suppressed. The IRA achieved partial success, but only after decades of violence and ultimately through negotiation, not military victory. Modern terrorist groups face similar limitations. They can disrupt, terrify, and destroy, but they struggle to build and govern. The Nazari assassins, viewed in comparative perspective, thus represent both the possibilities and limitations of asymmetric resistance. They showed what could be achieved, but also what couldn't. They demonstrated courage and commitment, but also the ultimate insufficiency of those qualities alone when facing determined, powerful enemies. Their story is inspiring and cautionary in equal measure, a reminder that resistance is possible, but victory is difficult, that surviving is sometimes the most that can be hoped for, that maintaining identity and faith through centuries of adversity is itself a kind of triumph, even when political and military goals remain unmet. Chapter 13. The Scholars Speak. Modern historical understanding. Our understanding of the Nizari assassins has evolved dramatically over the past 2 centuries as scholars gained access to new sources, developed better analytical methods, and freed themselves from medieval prejudices and propaganda. Tonight, let's trace this scholarly evolution, understanding how academic study has gradually revealed the historical reality behind the legends. Early Western scholarship on the assassins emerging in the 18th and 19th centuries relied heavily on Crusader chronicles, Marco Polo's account, and hostile Muslim sources. These scholars, products of European imperial culture, often approached Islamic history through Orientalist lenses that emphasized exoticism, violence, and supposedly fundamental differences between East and West. The assassins fit perfectly into these preconceptions. They were mysterious, violent, fanatical, Eastern. The Austrian scholar Joseph von Hammerperstal published an influential book on the assassins in 1818 that shaped European understanding for decades. Von Hammerperstal read numerous sources, but interpreted them through his own anti-Islamic and anti-Shia prejudices. He presented the assassins as evil incarnate, a demonic conspiracy that nearly destroyed Islamic civilization. His work, though based on real sources, was so biased as to be unreliable. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw more careful scholarship as European academics gained better access to Middle Eastern sources and developed more rigorous methods. Scholars began reading Nizari sources where they survived, not just hostile accounts. They examined archaeological evidence. They started asking more sophisticated questions about social organization, religious beliefs, and political contexts, rather than simply retelling sensational stories. A crucial breakthrough came with the work of Marshall Hodgson, an American scholar whose 1955 book, The Order of Assassins, remains influential. Hodgson carefully distinguished legend from documented history. He emphasized the Nizars' theological sophistication, their rational political calculations, their genuine religious convictions. He argued forcefully against the hashish theory and the Paradise Garden story, showing they were later inventions unsupported by contemporary evidence. Hodgson also pioneered placing the Nazis within broader contexts of Islamic history and Shia theology rather than treating them as bizarre anomalies. He showed how Nizari beliefs developed from earlier Ismaili theology, how their political strategies responded to specific historical circumstances, how their organization reflected both Persian political traditions and Islamic religious structures. This contextualization helped scholars see the Nizars as rational historical actors rather than inexplicable fanatics. Farid Daftari, a scholar of Ismaili studies, has built on Hodgson's foundation with extensive research into surviving Nizari texts and historical sources. His works published from the 1990s onward have further refined understanding of Nari theology, organization, and daily life. Daftari emphasizes the diversity within Nari communities, the evolution of their beliefs over time, and the ways they balanced religious ideals with practical necessities. Dafty and other recent scholars have also highlighted how much we don't know. The destruction of Alamut's library means huge gaps exist in our knowledge of Nizari theology, philosophy, and internal organization. We have chronicles describing assassinations, but limited information about the communities supporting the assassins. We know the Nazaris valued learning, but have few of their scholarly works. We understand their organizational structure and outline, but lack details about daily operations. Archaeological work, particularly at Alamut and other fortress sites, has provided physical evidence, complementing textual sources. Excavations have revealed fortress layouts, construction techniques, storage facilities, and living quarters. This archaeological data helps us understand the material conditions of Nizari life, the resources available to them, the challenges they faced maintaining fortresses in remote mountains. Modern scholars have also worked to understand the Nizaris' enemies better, reading Seljuk and other anti-Nizari sources more critically, recognizing propaganda and bias, extracting useful information while acknowledging distortions. This has revealed that the Nizaris faced genuine threats, that Sunni authorities' persecutions were severe and sometimes brutal, that the Nizaris' violent responses occurred in context of real persecution rather than unmotivated fanaticism. The relationship between Nazari theology and practice has received increased scholarly attention. How did esoteric religious beliefs justify assassination? What theological arguments made killing a religious duty? How did the Nazaris understand martyrdom? And how did this understanding motivate the Fidi? These questions don't have simple answers, but scholars have made progress in understanding the religious worldview that made Nazari violence comprehensible to participants. Recent scholarship has also examined the Nazis' relations with various neighbors and rivals. The picture that emerges is complex. The Nazis sometimes allied with groups one might expect to be enemies, made pragmatic accommodations with powerful neighbors, engaged in trade and diplomacy alongside assassination and warfare. They were political actors, not simply religious fanatics, and their decisions reflected calculations about survival and advantage. The question of Nazari effectiveness has been debated. Some scholars argue their assassination strategy was remarkably successful, allowing a small community to survive for nearly 2 centuries against powerful enemies. Others point out that the strategy had limitations, that the Nazaris never achieved more than defensive survival, that they ultimately couldn't prevent their destruction by the Mongols. Both assessments contain truth. Evaluating effectiveness depends on what metrics one uses. Gender and family life in Nazari communities has received less scholarly attention than military and political history, partly because sources are limited. We know women existed in these communities obviously, but details about their lives, roles, and experiences are scarce. Some scholars have tried to reconstruct women's experiences from fragmentary evidence, but large gaps remain. The scholarly consensus today rejects the most sensational legends about the assassins, while acknowledging the genuine violence and religious devotion that characterized the movement. Scholars understand the Nazis as a persecuted religious minority that developed effective defensive strategies, including targeted assassination, that maintained theological sophistication and organizational discipline, that valued learning and culture alongside military effectiveness, and that ultimately couldn't survive the Mongol storm, but transmitted their religious traditions to successor communities. This scholarly understanding rarely penetrates popular culture, where the legendary assassins remain more influential than the historical ones. Movies, novels, and video games continue portraying drug-addled fanatics, paradise gardens, and magical powers. This is frustrating for scholars, but understandable. Legends are more dramatic than reality, and entertainment prefers simplification over complexity. Yet, the scholarly work matters. It reveals human beings behind the legends, shows how real people faced impossible circumstances with courage and intelligence, demonstrates that history is more interesting than myth when we take time to understand it properly. The Nazaris weren't monsters or superheroes. They were people, believers who created something remarkable and survived longer than they probably should have given the forces a raid against them. Modern Nazaris have complicated relationships with this historical legacy. They're proud of their ancestors' courage and survival, but sometimes uncomfortable with the assassination history that draws sensational attention. The Aiken Development Network emphasizes the community's positive contributions to education, health, and economic development, connecting modern Nazaris to medieval predecessors' alleged valuation of learning and culture rather than to their violence. Scholars working with modern Nazari communities have access to some sources unavailable elsewhere. Oral traditions preserved within the community, family histories, religious texts passed down through generations. These sources have limitations. Obviously, oral traditions evolve over time. Community sources may have their own biases, but they provide perspectives unavailable from hostile external sources. As scholarship continues, our understanding of the Nazari assassins will likely evolve further. New archaeological discoveries might reveal previously unknown aspects of fortress life. Better analysis of surviving texts might illuminate theological questions. Comparative studies might place the Nazaris in broader contexts of medieval resistance movements, religious minorities, or asymmetric warfare. Each scholarly generation asks new questions, develops new methods, reveals new dimensions of this endlessly fascinating historical community. The work of scholars over the past 2 centuries has transformed the assassins from legendary monsters into understandable historical actors. From examples of Oriental depravity into a persecuted religious community that developed effective survival strategies, from drug-crazed fanatics into sophisticated believers, maintaining theological and organizational discipline. This transformation represents genuine progress in historical understanding, revealing truth behind legend, complexity beneath simplification, humanity within historical otherness. Chapter 14, Modern Echoes, the Assassins in Contemporary Imagination. As our long night's journey through assassin history approaches its end, let us consider how this medieval organization continues to echo through modern culture, politics, and imagination. The Nizari assassins' historical reality ended 8 centuries ago, but their legendary reputation thrives, constantly reinvented for new contexts and purposes. The word assassin itself is the most obvious legacy entering European languages, from Arabic through Crusader contacts. It became generic term for political killer, completely detached from its original religious and historical context. When modern news reports describe an assassin killed the prime minister, the speakers probably don't know they're referencing an 11th century Ismaili religious community. The word has been universalized, its specific origins forgotten by most users. Literature has repeatedly drawn on assassin imagery. The Romantic poets, fascinated by exotic Orient, referenced the Old Man of the Mountain in various works. Lord Byron mentioned the assassins in his poetry. Later 19th and 20th century adventure novels featured assassin-like villains, mysterious Eastern figures, controlling fanatical followers from hidden fortresses, threatening Western heroes. The mystery and espionage genres found the assassins endlessly useful. Secret societies with mysterious leaders, operatives willing to die for their cause, hidden fortresses in remote locations. All these assassin-derived tropes appear repeatedly. Sometimes the connection to historical Niceris is explicit. More often it's implicit, with authors borrowing elements without acknowledging their source. The 20th century saw the assassins enter new media. Film and television produced numerous works featuring the assassins or assassin-inspired organizations. The quality varied widely, from thoughtful historical dramas attempting accuracy to exploitation, films using assassin imagery for cheap thrills. Almost always the portrayals emphasized violence, mystery, and exotic otherness, while ignoring theological sophistication and community context. Vladimir Barl's 1938 novel Alamut deserves special mention. Written by a Slovenian author during the rise of European fascism, the novel uses the assassin story to explore themes of manipulation, belief, and political control. Its famous phrase, "Nothing is true, everything is permitted." Supposedly, the assassin motto was Bartle's invention, not historical, but it's been widely repeated and even incorporated into later assassin-related fiction. The video game franchise Assassin's Creed, launched in 2007, brought assassin imagery to a massive global audience. The games feature a fictional organization of assassins, supposedly descended from the historical Neris, fighting an equally fictional Templar organization across various historical periods. The games incorporate some historical details, but mostly use assassin imagery for atmospheric flavor, supporting science fiction and fantasy narratives. These games have done more to shape contemporary popular understanding of assassins than any historical scholarship. Millions of players worldwide have spent hundreds of hours engaging with Assassin's Creed games. For most, this will be their primary exposure to anything assassin-related. The game's mixture of historical detail and complete fabrication makes them problematic from educational perspectives, but they've undeniably kept assassin legends alive and visible. In political discourse, assassin references serve various rhetorical purposes. Critics of suicide terrorism sometimes invoke the assassins, claiming modern extremists are reviving medieval fanaticism. This comparison is usually superficial, ignoring crucial differences between Nizari targeted assassination and modern terrorism's mass casualty attacks. But the comparison is rhetorically powerful, connecting current threats to legendary historical villains. Conspiracy theories have embraced assassin imagery enthusiastically. Secret societies supposedly descended from the Nizaris allegedly control world events from behind the scenes. These theories usually combine assassin legends with Templar myths, Illuminati fantasies, and various other conspiracy theory elements, creating elaborate fictional histories with minimal connection to documented reality. The assassin's actual history is plenty interesting, but conspiracy theorists prefer imaginative elaboration. Middle Eastern politics sometimes sees assassin references. Syrian and Iranian leaders have occasionally invoked the Nasari heritage, claiming connection to this example of resistance against foreign oppression. These claims are politically motivated, selectively highlighting certain historical aspects while ignoring others. But they show that even in the region where the historical assassins operated, the legendary reputation sometimes overshadows historical reality. Academic conferences, museum exhibitions, and documentary films occasionally address the assassins from scholarly perspectives, trying to educate general audiences about historical reality versus legend. These efforts have limited reach compared to popular entertainment, but represent important counter-narratives, reminding people that beneath the legends lie real historical communities whose stories deserve accurate understanding. Modern Azaris, as mentioned earlier, have complicated relationships with the assassin legacy. The Aiken Development Network doesn't emphasize the assassination history in its public communications, understandably preferring to highlight the community's contributions to education, healthcare, and economic development. Yet, the Nazari community can't completely escape this history. It's part of their heritage, controversial and troubling as some aspects are. Some modern Nazis have reclaimed the history, arguing that the assassins were resistance fighters defending their community against genocidal persecution, that their tactics, while violent, were justified by circumstances, that they should be remembered as heroes of survival rather than as villains of fanaticism. This perspective has validity, but also risks romanticizing violence and oversimplifying complex historical situations. The broader Muslim world's relationship with the assassin legacy is mixed. Sunni Muslims, descendants of the assassin's historical enemies, generally view the Nazaris negatively as heretics and murderers. 12 Shia, the dominant branch of Shiism today, also distance themselves from the Nazaris, emphasizing doctrinal differences. The Nazaris remain a distinct minority within Islam, neither fully accepted by other Muslims nor completely isolated from broader Islamic culture. In Western military and intelligence circles, the assassins sometimes appear in discussions of asymmetric warfare, terrorism, and political murder. Special operations and counterterrorism courses occasionally study the assassins as historical examples of effective covert operations. Usually, these discussions acknowledge differences between medieval and modern contexts while identifying persistent strategic principles that transcend specific eras. Artists continue finding inspiration in assassin imagery. Paintings, sculptures, musical compositions, and performance art have all explored assassin themes. Some artists are drawn to the aesthetic, the imagery of mountain fortresses and shadowy killers. Others engage with deeper themes, faith and violence, resistance and fanaticism, the ethics of asymmetric warfare, the relationship between means and ends. The persistence of assassin imagery in modern culture across multiple media and contexts testifies to the story's enduring power. Something about the Nazaris, their absolute commitment, their willingness to sacrifice, their mysterious fortress organization, their effectiveness despite weakness continues to fascinate and trouble us. We see in them reflections of contemporary anxieties about terrorism, religious extremism, political violence, secret societies, and the limits of resistance. Yet this modern fascination rarely engages, seriously, with the actual historical Nazars. It prefers legends to reality, simplification to complexity, dramatic villains or heroes to complicated human beings facing impossible choices. This is unfortunate but perhaps inevitable. Popular culture simplifies. Mythology makes patterns from chaos. Entertainment prefers clarity to ambiguity. Still, the historical Nasari Ismail deserve better than to be reduced to stereotypes and legends. They were real people, believers who created something remarkable under extraordinary circumstances, who maintained identity and faith through persecution, who adapted to survive, who ultimately couldn't prevent their political destruction, but transmitted their religious traditions through centuries. Their story, accurately understood, is more compelling than any legend, more human, and therefore more meaningful. As we prepare to conclude our journey through assassin history, consider what this legacy means. A small 11th century religious community's desperate resistance strategy became legendary. Their names synonymous with political murder. Their story endlessly retold and reimagined. They live on not just in their Nereus Melli descendants, but in cultural imagination, transformed into symbols and archetypes, sometimes heroic, sometimes villainous, always fascinating. This is memory's strange alchemy, turning history into legend, people into myths, complex reality into simple story. The truth about the assassins lies buried beneath centuries of legend, but it's worth excavating, worth understanding on its own terms, worth preserving against the simplifications of myth. Conclusion echoes from Alamut. Our journey through 9 centuries of history approaches its end. We've climbed mountain paths to fortress strongholds, walked through gardens that may never have existed, stood in markets where daggers flashed, witnessed the fall of an organization and the survival of a faith. We've met believers and killers, often the same people, trying to understand their motivations, their methods, their humanity. What can we conclude about the Nazari assassins? Perhaps that simple conclusions are impossible, that this history resists reduction to moral lessons or political allegories. The Nazaris were neither pure heroes nor complete villains. They were people facing impossible circumstances with courage, faith, intelligence, and violence. They created something remarkable and terrible, an organization that defended a persecuted minority while embracing political murder, that valued learning while training killers, that survived for nearly 2 centuries before being destroyed. The theological disputes that birthed the Nasari movement seem distant and arcane. Now, most of us don't care whether the 7th Imam was Ismail or Musa, whether religious truth requires outer conformity or inner enlightenment, whether the Imam's authority derives from descent or spiritual knowledge. But for the Nazaris, these questions weren't academic. They were existential, worth dying for, worth killing for. Understanding this helps us grasp how deeply religious belief can shape human behavior for better and worse. The fortress network, that discontinuous state of eagles' nests scattered through Persian mountains, represented extraordinary achievement. Building and maintaining these strongholds required resources, organization, and determination. The fortresses provided security for a persecuted community, bases for operations, spaces where distinctive religious beliefs could be openly practiced and transmitted to children. Even in ruins, they testify to human capacity for creation in adverse circumstances. The assassination strategy, controversial then and now, demonstrated asymmetric warfare's possibilities and limitations. A small, weak community couldn't defeat powerful enemies conventionally, but could make opposing them personally dangerous for specific decision-makers. The strategy worked well enough to prevent the Nazaris' destruction for nearly 2 centuries, but not well enough to win genuine security. It bought time, but not peace, survival, but not triumph. The destruction by the Mongols reminds us of history's fragility, how quickly centuries of achievement can vanish. Alamut's library burning, its manuscripts feeding flames, represents incalculable loss. We'll never know what philosophical insights, scientific observations, historical records, and literary works died in those fires. The Mongol conquests destroyed not just the Nazari state, but much of the evidence we need to fully understand it. Yet the Nazari survived as a religious community, adapting to new circumstances, maintaining their faith through centuries of hardship and concealment. This survival, less dramatic than the fortress period, but equally remarkable, shows that communities defined by shared beliefs and identities can endure political and military defeats. The organization called the Assassins ended. The Nazari's faith persisted. The legendary assassins, the drug-crazed fanatics of popular imagination, never existed. But the legend's persistence tells us something about human psychology and cultural transmission. We prefer simple stories to complex realities, dramatic villains to ordinary people making difficult choices, exotic otherness to recognizable humanity. The assassin legends served various purposes over centuries. They explained what seemed incomprehensible. They justified fears and prejudices. They provided entertaining stories. They offered symbols for discussing violence and faith. But the historical Nasaris were neither the legend's monsters nor their heroes. They were people, communities, believers trying to survive and maintain their faith in hostile environments. They made choices we might question or condemn, adopted tactics that trouble us, but they did so for reasons they found compelling in circumstances we should try to understand, even if we can't fully approve their actions. What lessons, if any, should we take from this history? Perhaps that religious persecution breeds resistance, that communities will defend themselves however they can, that violence begets violence in cycles difficult to escape. Perhaps that even small, weak groups can survive against overwhelming odds, if sufficiently determined and clever. Perhaps that the line between terrorism and resistance, between legitimate self-defense and murder, is harder to draw than we might wish. Or perhaps the lesson is simply that history is complicated, that medieval people faced dilemmas without good answers, that judging them from our comfortable distance risks self-righteousness. That understanding requires empathy, even toward those whose actions we find troubling. The Nazaris don't need our approval. They need our honest attempt to understand them on their own terms, in their own contexts. As you drift toward sleep, let your mind rest with these final images. Alamut at sunrise, morning light touching ancient stones, the valley below emerging from night's shadows. The fortress is empty now, its walls broken, its chambers open to wind and rain. No one prays in its mosque. No scholars study in its library. No warriors train in its courtyards. Birds nest where assassins once planned their missions. Grass grows where feet once walked. But in cities across the world, Nereus Smileys live, work, pray, raise children, maintain their faith. They are the assassin's true legacy, not the fortresses or the violence, but the community that survived, the beliefs that persisted, the traditions transmitted through centuries despite persecution and hardship. They remember Alamut not as ruin, but as symbol of their ancestors' courage and determination. The assassins fought their battles 8 centuries ago. Their organization ended. Their fortresses fell. But their story persists, endlessly retold, constantly reinterpreted, forever fascinating. We tell their story because it touches something deep in human experience. Questions about faith and violence, resistance and oppression, how to survive when more powerful forces seek your destruction. What price is worth paying for beliefs? Where to draw lines between acceptable and unacceptable tactics? These questions have no easy answers. The Nazaris' responses to them, whatever we think of those responses, were genuine attempts by real people to navigate impossible circumstances. Their courage was real. Their faith was real. Their suffering was real. Their violence was real. All of it was real, human, historically specific, yet somehow universal in its core dilemmas. Sleep now, knowing that the story has been told, that the assassins have been remembered not just as legends, but as people, that somewhere in ruined fortresses and living communities, their memory persists. The echoes from Alamut fade, but never completely silence, calling across centuries, reminding us that history's actors were human, like us, facing choices, making decisions, trying to do what seemed right in their time and place. The real history of the assassins is complete. The legend continues. Both matter. Both teach us something. Both deserve remembering. Good night. Dream of mountain fortresses and endless faith, of daggers and prayers, of people long dead whose decisions still echo in our world. The assassin story is finished, yet it continues in every retelling, including this one. In this quiet moment, as night deepens and sleep approaches, carrying you gently toward rest and dreams,